The problem with these supplements, whether they be mineral or vitamin supplements, is they create serious imbalances. When you take the vitamins and minerals in their original packages, which are starches, vegetables, and fruits, they're in proper balances with other vitamins and minerals, with phytates and fibers and proteins, and an environment that's been developed over tens of millions of years. Now what happens is you take an isolated nutrient out, say vitamin C or iron or zinc or something, and you concentrate it in a pill. Now you give it back to the person, and you've created serious imbalances in the body, which lead to higher cholesterol, which lead to higher bad cholesterol, lower good cholesterol, more artery closure. In elderly people taking vitamin E, for example, they get more serious respiratory infections and other problems. It's a bad thing to do. It's a very profitable thing to do, but it's not a healthy thing to do. Get your fruits and vegetables from their natural packages and just throw that garbage off your bathroom shelves. It's doing you no good and a lot of harm.
Hey everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's live Q&A with the great Dr. Peter Rogers. If you've been following my channel or newsletter, you already know Dr. Rogers' background, but let me give a quick recap. He studied at Stanford, at Harvard. He finished at the top of his class and earned the highest medical board scores possible. In short, Peter Rogers is a genius. He's got a photographic memory. He devours enormous amounts of research, and more importantly, he can synthesize that information and cut through the noise. He knows which sources are most accurate, and he puts the puzzle together in a way that's both scientifically sound and incredibly practical. And he's here today to answer your questions. So if you've got a medical issue, a mystery symptom, or you just want to know the latest science about health, diet, aging, or disease prevention, you're in the right place. I also want to mention that if you're not already subscribed to my newsletter on Substack, you should be. I post announcements when we're doing these Q&As. I post them there first, and that's the best way to be first in line when we do these, because we go first question asked is the first question answered, and so on. They're done in the order that they went up. You'll find the link to my Substack in the description below. And if you post your question in the hour or two after my email announcement goes out, you're pretty much guaranteed to have your question answered. So we try to go through as many questions as we can and keep the pace moving. Before we start, a new study just came out that I want to mention. My friend Jeff Novick sent this to me this morning. Here it is. It is very similar to the famous BROAD study out of New Zealand. The BROAD study was a study where participants followed Dr. McDougall's maximum weight loss program, and they had the best weight loss results ever recorded in a free living, no calorie counting trial. Now, this new one, this is from Slovakia. It's also based on an ad libitum, whole food, plant-based diet, no animal products, no oils, no processed foods, just like McDougall, and you didn't count your calories. And over just 5 weeks, the women in the study lost an average of about 5 kilos, which is about 11 pounds. And after 12 weeks total, including 7 weeks without any formal program, they had lost almost 7 kilos, or around 15 pounds on average. And most of that was fat mass, and their LDL cholesterol and their blood pressure dropped significantly. And this was done in Slovakia, as I say, but it was all through the internet. There were no in-person meetings, just online support. And the results, they weren't quite as strong as the BROAD study, where participants lost over 19 pounds in 12 weeks rather than just 15. But the difference might be due to one small tweak in the Slovakia study. This newer study added a tablespoon each of flax and sunflower seeds every day, along with B12, D, and iodine supplements. So that little bit extra fat, a couple hundred calories a day, maybe they were consuming, that might explain why the results didn't quite match the BROAD study. They didn't lose quite as much weight, whereas the BROAD didn't include added fats or nuts or anything, and they did better. Still, this is very impressive results from a fully remote, low-cost program with no calorie counting and no exercise required, just real food and group support. So I'm going to close that out. And so with that, Peter, how's your Saturday going?
Good.
Yeah. Now, I know we talked you have a brand new book that's just come out, which we're going to talk about another time. Can you show us that? It's about weight loss,
Sure.
right?
How to prevent and reverse obesity, with Venus on the cover as the goal and the Mona Lisa on the back as the past, before and after pictures.
I love it. Well, that's great. We'll look forward to looking into that more deeply. Shall we jump in? Let's just get into this. Where is it? Okay. So let me get my stuff lined up correctly. There we go. All right. So the first question down at the bottom there, any advice for eye floaters, their cause and possible relief, wondering if they are diet related?
Yeah, a lot of times they'll go away, and pretty much for any problem in the body. The reason why I'll recommend the low-fat vegan diet, like Dr. McDougall said, if a person tells me they have earwax, he's going to recommend the McDougall diet for them. Because if you want to heal anything, you want to make sure you have good blood flow. How do you get good blood flow? You minimize dietary salt, you minimize dietary fat, especially dietary fat. And that tends to make you healthier. If you look at the most common causes of eye problems, I have a mnemonic for that, CDAWG, so CDAHG. So that's like cataracts, diabetes, age-related macular degeneration, hypertension, and glaucoma. They're associated with hypertension. They're associated with dairy, especially the cataracts. They're all manifestations of vascular disease. So you avoid the risk factors of atherosclerosis, and that can help. And hopefully that'll be enough. If it still doesn't go away pretty fast, obviously go see your doctor in case it's, some other less common cause.
Great. So next, I bake 100% whole wheat sourdough. I've had a hard time figuring out how much of the various anti-nutrients are neutralized during the fermentation process. Any clean data? Would using sprouted whole wheat be preferable?
Yeah, I don't have experience eating bread. I don't eat bread. I only eat things that have a single ingredient. Usually when you start making bread and stuff, you have to use multiple ingredients. If you've got, homegrown stuff, you do it yourself at home, that's reasonable. I know our ancestors ate bread for thousands of years, but I don't have much experience with it.
Okay, next question. On a very low-fat, high-starch diet, if someone consistently overeats and gains weight, say 4,000 plus calories a day, is the fat stored mostly benign subcutaneous fat, or can excess starch eventually lead to harmful visceral and or intramyocellular fat over time?
If you're deliberately eating 4,000 calories, what are you trying to make yourself fat? You might gain some weight. And some will go sub-Q, but some is going to go to the liver, some will go to the muscle. So, I don't see that as a very useful question.
Got it. Is moderate fat vegan advisable if you're in your 20s and trying to gain weight? If not, do you recommend any weight gaining strategies?
Well, the higher the percentage of calories from fat, the more likely a person is going to gain weight. So, the lowest percentage of calorie fat things to lose weight would be things like white rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, lentils as beans. But then you start getting up into higher fat plant foods, things like garbanzo beans are about 13% of calories from fat. Oatmeal's in the ballpark of 15. Quinoa is somewhere similar. If you're young and you're really active and you find yourself getting too skinny, you could do all those things, okay? In his studies, Kempner used to allow them to have just simple sugars to maintain their weight if the patients felt they were getting too skinny on his rice diet. But so, you can eat fruits. Some people are pretty skinny on fruits, but the thing about fruits is one can eat them in tremendous quantities. They don't satisfy hunger the same way that starches do. So if you're young, you're really active, those are some things you can do.
Great. Next, do you care at all about origin for organics? For example, how much do you trust organic produce from foreign countries like Mexico, Peru, Turkey? Do you have a strong preference for U.S. organic over foreign what foreign countries might you avoid?
Well, I used to think U.S. and Canada would be the best places for organic. I'm not as certain of that as I used to be. And I have heard bad things about organic from some countries. I have heard bad things about organic from China, but I don't know for sure if that's true. I would prefer, though, I sort of trust USA, Canada, and Europe more than I do other places. But, I don't know for sure. I don't have proven reliable data for that.
Okay, next, do you have any opinion on carbonated water with the machines like SodaStream, assuming not adding any sugar? Do you consider that type of carbonation health neutral?
No, it's still carbonic acid. That's still going to increase your risk of cavities. I would recommend avoiding that stuff. Good. Acid wears through your enamel. It increases cavities. Carbonated beverages are known to worsen cavities. I wouldn't go down that path. They can give you sensitivity also.
Both Dr. Bernard and Dr. Campbell say in their books and videos that the estrogen compounds in soy are harmless for both men and women, yet Dr. Rogers always warns about this. This seems to be going back on misunderstandings of the research. Please look into it again and make another video if necessary. Of course, they still have too much fat, but this estrogen stuff is way over the top, right? Okay.
No. I think they're wrong. Okay. If you go back to the early papers before you got all the corporate papers, soy is associated with lower testosterone, lower sperm counts, deformity of female reproductive tract, premature puberty. It's a tremendously overrated food. It's one of the most overrated foods. It's highly estrogenic. It's highly goitrogenic. I would never eat anything with soy in it. Okay. And people say, well, a lot of these Asians are skinny and healthy. They eat relatively minimal amounts of homegrown soy. Most soy in the Western world is GMO. Okay. It's often processed with hexane, which is a neurotoxin. It's best avoided.
Great. Is your big book on health, you mentioned not making it as cold for sleeping since you get up to void less when it's warmer. Can you provide more details? And is there science involved, or is this just a personal anecdote?
Well, it's a personal anecdote. I mean, basically, the more liquids you drink at night, and I eat the OMAD diet, 1 meal a day, which is convenient because I work all day and I come home at night, I eat a good-sized dinner. So the more liquids you take on, the more likely you're going to have to wake up to void. If you make the room hotter so you might sweat a little bit, at least you're not cold. When you're cold, you vasoconstrict in your periphery and you make more urine. So that's what it's about, is having one less time to wake up the void. As men get older, their prostate gets a little bigger and they're more likely to have to wake up the void.
Right. Okay. So this next one, vegan equals V equals male and female. Egan equals strong in body and mind. Letter V, male from bottom and female from top. Knowledge is a superpower, become a superhero. Okay.
That sounds like a little craziness there, yeah.
Okay. So just a note for you guys to know, I'm in Italy and I saw your title directly translated in Italian. Another voice saying in Italian what you're saying without me putting any translation was so weird, but also awesome for all the people who don't speak English. Something happening on YouTube. Thank you both. Okay. I've heard that. Someone said, oh, your voice in Italian or your voice in German sounds terrible. I don't know. I don't control that. Can you tell us more about any discussions you had with Dr. Esselstyn when you attended his seminar?
Yeah, I had a friend who was like a patient of Dr. Esselstyn, and I went with him to a Dr. Esselstyn seminar over at the Cleveland Clinic, and it was very good. And there was just one thing a little bit funny about it was Dr. Esselstyn tremendously emphasizes nitric oxide. And while he was giving his lecture, you know, I raised my hand a few times and said, what about this? What about this? And he would tell me, I'll talk to you later. I'll talk to you later. And he came by and spoke to me later afterwards, and my friend, and he said, the most important thing is that they understand nitric oxide. He said, if they understand nitric oxide, they will follow the diet and they will be successful. He says, if I go into all this other detail, it'll just confuse them. And I think he's right. Okay, that was the big topic of our conversation. We chatted a little more than that, but that was the big topic.
Interesting. Good. All right. So next, which specific plant-based foods do you recommend for quickly reducing chronic inflammation, and how does their impact compare to pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories according to scientific evidence?
Yeah, and one thing I would say about Esselstyn too, he had 89% compliance with his diet, which is extraordinarily high, in part because the patients were self-selected. They went to him for help with their coronary artery disease problems, but it's also extraordinarily high. He makes it clear and simple, and it works. So, you know, that's a good thing, what he's doing. It's effective. Okay, yeah, let me see the question again about for reducing chronic inflammation. Well, if you want to reduce chronic inflammation, avoid animal foods. They increase inflammation. Meat eaters have higher WBC counts. It also increases your risk of leaky gut. So anything that increases leaky gut, including all the animal foods, all the oils, you know, there's a lot of things you can do to reduce leaky gut. The fluoride in your water, the chloride in your water, that'll change your gut microbiome, the aluminum in your water. That's why you got to have you should have a reverse osmosis in your kitchen. And it's good to have a whole house carbon filter. And I won't eat any processed foods. The emulsifiers in there predispose to leaky gut. So those are just some of the many things you can do. I've made previous videos where I'll go through about 25 different causes of leaky gut. And that's another reason processed foods have all kinds of things in them. Carrageenan, polysorbates, all kinds of strange chemicals that increase your risk of leaky gut. Leaky gut allows bacterial endotoxins and bacteria themselves even to get into your blood, and that causes systemic inflammation.
Cool. Next question. My mother was recently diagnosed with small vessel disease after a brain scan. How is this caused, and is there anything she can do to cure or slow it down?
Yeah, for every macro for dictating a brain MRI, it says periventricular flare hyperintensities. Flare is a sequence, so hyperintensity is a bright signal on the brain MRI. So these are bright spots. They originally were called UBOs way back in the early 1990s, unidentified bright objects on a brain MRI. They're now thought to be little strokes in the white matter tissue, okay? And basically, they're caused by the same things that cause, other strokes: ischemia, lack of oxygen supply to the brain, diabetes, hypertension, atherosclerosis. So you want to minimize the risk factor for all those things. And one of the things you have to watch out is a lot of brain underperfusion is caused by overtreatment of hypertension. The reason you have a blood pressure is to get blood to the top of your brain, to pump blood against gravity to your cerebral cortex. So if you're overtreating your hypertension, you're dropping your pressure too low. That's one of the most common reasons that old people fall, is they've overtreated their hypertension. So the smart thing to do is optimize your blood pressure as much as possible by optimizing your diet: low-fat, vegan, no oil, and minimize the added dietary salt, or at least increase your K factor of potassium by eating a lot of plant foods. Plant foods are very high in potassium. Processed foods are very high in sodium, low in potassium. So by avoiding the processed foods, eating the plant foods, you'll tend to have a good K factor. Again, that's the ratio of potassium to sodium to optimize your blood pressure. So you can minimize the medications you take and thus not have these episodes of overtreated hypertension leading to hypotension, a drop in the blood pressure to the brain. So that protects you, because that's all it is. Consider it like atherosclerosis and hypotension related mini strokes. And the relevance also is when you have a mini stroke in the brain, these little bright spots, what that means is you have a core of dead brain tissue and some surrounding dysfunctional brain tissue that has an impaired blood-brain barrier. So if you get leaky gut, toxins that get through your blood have increased ability to access your brain tissue, your brain parenchyma. So you're at risk for expansion of those little mini strokes. That's why you really want to optimize your health parameters. In my experience, most people think that they're healthier than they are. And so what I would say is there's some things we can't really completely control. So control everything you can and try to optimize it as much as you can. Because in a lot of old people, they get cognitively slower and their energy levels drop. They're losing mitochondrial function. And then they start to lose the ability to turn anything around. So you want to prevent all that as much as you can. And exercising helps a lot to prevent that.
Great. Here's the next one. I think this is sort of meant to be argumentative. There are 3 sources of evidence 100% veganism does not provide the health and longevity advantage vegan authorities broadcast. Okay, I disagree with the premise, but 1, all blue zones are not vegan, right? 2, nationally, Monaco, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea have highest life expectancy. Neither are significantly vegan. 3, vegans do get cancer and other diseases. That suggests vegan authorities might not understand all causative inputs for a shortened lifespan. Any comment?
Yeah, well, a couple things. First of all, they did have extraordinary long lifespans. The Seventh-day Adventists that were vegan, as well as Okinawa, for example. And on the original lectures of Dan Buettner, he used to say they were 95% plant-based. On his later lectures, he would start saying 90% plant-based. I've seen these numbers from the so-called longevity populations now, and I kind of doubt them. Over time, I'm sad to say it, but a lot of research has become less reliable. It's more corporate influenced. And, I've worked at a lot of Western hospitals. It's uncommon for me to see a patient over 80 years of age. I don't think patients live as long as they're saying. I see tons of patients in their 60s and 70s and quite a few in their 50s. It's uncommon that I see people in their 80s. I mean, I see some, but not that many. To see somebody in their 90s, that's quite rare in my experience. So I don't think people are living that long. There's now, the corporations are aware there's billions of dollars involved in shaping how people eat. And once corporations get involved in research data, or they pay off these institutions, whatever, these international organizations, the data becomes much less reliable. So I don't believe it, is what I'm basically saying.
Yeah. Okay. Excuse me. Before going SOS-free, plant exclusive, my blood pressure is 180 over 110. It's now 114 over 70, which makes me satisfied. However, I use up to 1 gram per day of potassium chloride in my cooking instead of normal salt. Are there any negative health aspects of using potassium chloride in cooking?
Well, a lot of times it's partially substituted, because if you fully substitute it for NaCl, it'll get a metallic taste. But there are pretty good success results behind it. The big thing was Finland. Finland in the 1970s and 80s, it was led by a doctor named Pekka Puska. They switched out KCl for a lot of their NaCl, and they did some other things, reducing their intake of dairy and whatnot, but they had an 87% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. That's extraordinary. Like 100% would be the highest you could have. So it can be helpful. It's been shown that it can lower blood pressure even with relatively small amounts of substitution, like 30%. So if you're okay with the taste of it, I'm not aware of major side effects from it. A lot of people don't like the taste of it, though. Some feel it's just metallic and they just don't like it, even if they partially substitute it. So you could try it. What I do is I just don't add salt to my food.
I actually kind of like it. Heinz makes one, a no salt ketchup that uses it, and I find it tasty. All right, 2 questions for Dr. Rogers. 1, should I worry about low HDL per the doctor? They also think my vitamin D is too low at 37.2, but I think Dr. Rogers wouldn't agree. I'm 57-year-old female, 5'4", 105 pounds, whole food, plant-based, 8 years with some pleasure trap failures, but super strict in the last 60 days before blood test. And there's your numbers, 143 total, 37 HDL, 3.8 to the ratio. And number 2, any insight on what to do about urge incontinence?
Yeah, let me address this cholesterol question first.
Yes.
When your total cholesterol comes down, that's a really low total cholesterol, below 150, to have a total cholesterol 143. That's a great number. If you do that by diet, you'll probably never have a cardiovascular event. You don't get as much benefit when you do it with medications. You know, if you get a statin derived total cholesterol 143, you know, it's okay, but it's not as the same thing as getting it from your diet. LDL is going to go down. It's like if you had a total watermelon of cholesterol with a total, let's say 250, and then you knock the total down to 143, your HDL is going to go down. I think HDL is totally overrated. I don't think it's that useful. It gets talked a lot because they're always trying to come up with a way to sell more drugs. But, you know, Dr. McDougall wouldn't even check it. I think it's totally overrated, HDL. I wouldn't worry about it. Oh, and then as far as the vitamin D, you know, I agree with Dr. McDougall. You know, get out in the sun, get what you can. They exaggerate the amount of vitamin D deficiency. Again, it's a way to sell more pills. And getting out in the sun, it doesn't take that much time. You know, we're in summertime right now. Just get out when you can and get some sun exposure. Don't get sunburned, but that's the best way to get it, because there's other benefits you get from getting the sun besides just the vitamin D production itself. And that's not the active form. That's the inactive form that's measured in the blood.
So the second question, any insight on what to do about urge incontinence, key in the door when you get home and all of a sudden can't get to the bathroom fast enough, not stress incontinence from jumping, etc. Do Kegels really make a difference? Kegels have been impossible for me to keep up with regularly. So far, omitting acidic, spicy foods, decaf tea, etc. hasn't helped.
Yeah, you can try all that stuff like Kegels. You can try training your bladder to being able to hold it longer. If you're driving home from work, you can void right before you leave for home. You know, they try to build up the pelvis muscular layer, but eventually, you know, if it's still not working and it's really giving you a lot of problem, you could decrease your intake of liquids before you have to have a long time when it's inconvenient to void. You can even put an insert into the vagina to compress the urethra and decrease the voiding. There's surgical procedures that can be used to treat it. There's medications that can be used to treat it. So you can consider all those things. I would go see a gynae first. You know, see what they have to say. And then if they don't help you, go see a urologist.
Next question, confusing advice on plant foods from some doctors who vehemently oppose certain foods that are in total opposition, those recommended by Rogers, McDougall, Esselstyn, Ornish. Most common names I hear plant foods to avoid are bananas, oatmeal, blueberries. Dr. Ken Berry, for example, says one of his videos that oatmeal is the worst food anyone could eat. Gundry in a YouTube video says similar things about blueberries. Quite a few other YouTube doctors, lambast, white potatoes, and bananas.
Yeah, well, I think what it kind of comes down to is there's no money in helping the public, okay? The public, you know, what are you going to do? What can a patient do for a doctor? You know, the insurance pays, not the patient. All they can do is say thank you. What I'm trying to say is some nutrition, so-called experts, physicians or whatever, they're being paid as much as $1 million a year to promote things like olive oil and these other popular foods. And, you know, the meat industry, the processed food industry, they know that if the public went low-fat vegan, you not only lose money for them selling their food, whatever it might be, but the pharmaceutical industry would lose money. So there's no financial interest in helping the public to be healthy. I say that because, you know, the guys on the internet telling people to eat all this high-fat food, paleo, keto, carnivore, things like that, they get many hundreds of thousands of views, even millions of views. Whereas people teaching low-fat vegan, you'll get a few hundred views, okay? Or, you know, maybe if you're lucky, a few thousand views. So this information is kind of suppressed. Corporations can also pay a lot of money so they can get the videos of these guys promoting paleo, keto, carnivore out there. If you go back and you read the original work of Dr. Kempner, Dr. Dennis Burkitt, Nathan Pritikin, Dr. Ornish, Dr. McDougall, Dr. Esselstyn, you can see, and then you look at all the epidemiology of the populations that didn't have any coronary artery disease or hypertension. They were eating low-fat plant-based diets. So that's good information, and that's before all the corporate money started buying the journals and buying the scientists. So, That's why I'm very confident about it. I recommend read Kempner's book. It's available at the drmcdougall.com website. Read that early stuff. You'll be amazed. Read Nathan Pritikin. Nathan Pritikin was a genius. He summarized all the literature on fat, and he came to the conclusion all fat is bad. And I agree with that. All dietary fat is bad. Just because you'll get the amount of omega-3s and omega-6s that are essential fats just from eating low-fat plant foods. It's something you don't need to seek. You can't be too low in it. So it's sort of a non-issue.
Great. Next question. What can we do to protect our skin from itchy pigmentation rashes? Is it diet related? And will the skin pigment go back to normal color after time if you stop scratching the itch? I'm guessing the dark pigment comes from scratching the area. Your suggestion appreciated.
Yeah, a lot of stuff is probably due to leaky gut or other mechanisms of autoimmune disease, for example. Like I can tell you, my girlfriend used to have all these hives, and she said she became a vegan after dating me. We've been going on 6 months. And she said their hives all went away. Doesn't mean that it's always going to be hives or food sensitivities. You can try elimination diets too, if it's some type of food sensitivity, and see if that helps. Sometimes it could be a chemical that's in your laundry detergent, for example, and you're getting it from your blanket or your pillowcase or whatever. So I would try all those things. See if you can get that figured out. Just do your pillowcase, your blanket in just plain water through the laundry. See if that helps. Don't use laundry detergent. I don't even use laundry detergent. I just put my clothes in the washer, run the cycle, maybe a little longer, a little hotter. I don't use any softener things in the anti-wrinkle stuff in the dryer. Those are additional things you can do to prevent it, because it's probably either something you're eating or something that's contacting your skin.
Great. Okay. What are the long-term side effects of the daughters who were exposed to DES in utero? I know the common issues like sterility in females, males, malformed sex organs, and higher rates of vaginal cervical cancer. I've met a few daughters with joint issues. I've been whole food SOS free, but continue to have ongoing joint issues despite inflammatory markers all negative.
Yeah, so I would say, Dr. McDougall wrote an essay one time, diet is the only hope for arthritis. And I would say you want to really get the dietary fat down. Because a lot of people tell me, oh, they're a vegan or they eat plant-based, but they're eating a lot of high-fat food or processed food, things like that. I only eat single ingredient because if there's a second ingredient, they can put additional things in there like MSG, MFG, for example. Minimizing dietary salt prevents vasoconstriction, narrowing of the arteries, so you get better blood supply to the joints. Avoiding everything that can cause leaky gut, which includes a whole bunch of chemicals. Things like I mentioned, having a reverse osmosis filter for your drinking water, because the fluoride and the aluminum, they both increase the risk of leaky gut. Chloride a little bit because it can change the gut flora. I mean, it sanitizes the water, so it can affect your bacteria in your gut. So go through that whole list of about 25 things that cause leaky gut, because maybe by avoiding them, you'll decrease the stomach inflammation and you'll reduce your joint pain. Because you could, just like you damage the endothelial glycocalyx by eating high-fat diets, your cartilage anatomy is rather similar. You can be decreasing your cartilage integrity of the structure of the joints by eating the poor diet. So I would see if that helps. Hopefully it'll help.
Yeah, I know in your talk last week, you went through that list again. That's very helpful. And in fact, you've had it in several talks. Next question, 100% plant-based since 2013, no junk. I missed white rice, so last year bought 20-pound bag jasmine rice for family of 3 manufactured in India, so I thought it was better than from the American South. Arsenic was used in cotton fields to kill boll weevils, still in soil. Ate about a cup 3 times a week. Recently tested positive for elevated arsenic and lead. Not high enough for chelation. What foods can I eat to eliminate? Doctor said stop rice, increase polyphenol-rich foods to increase antioxidants to help body remove these toxins. After 6 weeks, I'm feeling improvement. Your comment?
Yeah, well, one thing is I think it's good to sweat. There's an interesting article I was reading not that long ago about your sweat. You think of your sweat glands as being like little kidneys, and they also excrete toxins from your body. They do excrete arsenic, they excrete lead, they excrete mercury and cadmium. So when you're sweating more, you're helping to get that stuff out of your body. I kind of like the heat. A lot of people don't, and they almost think it's unnatural to sweat. I don't mind it at all. If it's hot outside, I'll just leave it hot, and I'll sweat. So what? I'll just, throw the sweatshirt into the laundry. That's a way to decrease those things from your body a bit. And everybody talks about rice having all the arsenic problems, but it's actually in a lot of foods. It's in a lot of beer. It's in apple juice, and it's in a bunch of other things too. Grape juice, I know it's in. You know, there's an interesting lady by the name of Lead Safe Mama. If you check out her website, her name is Tamara Rubin. It might be something even like tamararubin.com. She tests all kinds of things for lead, because what I'm saying is you want to avoid any additional exposures to lead or arsenic if you've already had some. Chicken and poultry can be really high in arsenic. Where that comes from is a chicken and the poultry, they'll have intestinal parasites, and they give them arsenic-containing antibiotics. And that's used because they also found it makes their flesh look pinker and fresher in the stores. The reason rice got a problem was there's two things. There's the original cotton farming where they use arsenic pesticides in the southeastern United States on the cotton fields because it's a textile product. They could spray a lot and it stays in the soil for a long time. But they also, even to some of the organic farmers, they sold the chicken feces as a fertilizer. The organic farmers didn't know it had arsenic in it initially, and that's how some arsenic got into the rice as well. Some rice growers will show it on their website, you know, how much arsenic is in there, so you can use that as a guide. I still eat rice, by the way. I eat it almost every day. I've never had a problem with it. Dr. McDougall said that he never in his whole career saw a single case of arsenic toxicity from rice. So I think it's much less common than it's talked about. And again, rice gets exaggerated, the problem, because it has such a reputation as being a great food. And then you don't hear about it for these other things that'll often have a lot more. So yeah, white rice has much less arsenic than brown rice because in the process of removing the bran, the outer part of it, that removes most of the arsenic. And when I eat rice, I rinse it twice in reverse osmosis water. You know, I stir it with my finger, and you know, you'll see parts, you know, float up to the top. I don't know exactly how much of that is arsenic, but I'll rinse it twice before I'll cook it. And I always cook it in reverse osmosis water and stainless steel.
Great. Okay. Will there be a recording? Yes, there's always a recording of these live streams so that you can see them later. Another potassium chloride is a salt substitute. You kind of answered this. Borderline hypertension early in the morning, normalizes afternoon due to K-factor concept explained. Potassium chloride should be good heart health, right?
Yeah, we got that one.
You already said so. Can myelin sheath reduction with increase in age be reduced through diet?
Okay, when you talk about myelin sheath reduction, you're often talking about demyelinating disease, something like multiple sclerosis. Some people will even say these periventricular white matter flare hyperintensities you see on a brain MRI are in part due to demyelination. So either way, the same things you would do to prevent atherosclerosis, they help you to prevent autoimmune disease, like multiple sclerosis, for example, because leaky gut is not just a risk factor for autoimmune disease, it's also a risk factor for atherosclerosis, because when the bacterial endotoxins get into the blood, so what happens basically is when you eat dietary fiber, the fiber is taken by the good bacteria. They convert it into short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate. The butyrate goes to the gut lining cells, and they make that in a tight junction. So between each cell, let's say this pen is the tight junction. There has to be a tight junction. And the butyrate is used to make this tight junction. If you don't have the butyrate from the fiber, then you don't have a tight junction. And then bacteria can pass their endotoxins. Gram-negative bacteria will pass, you know, like LPS. Gram-positive bacteria will pass LTA. So that's lipopolysaccharide or lipoteichoic acid. That gets into the blood, and it'll change the shape of the blood clotting protein fibrinogen from being alpha helix, which is like a slinky, to flattening out and becoming beta pleated sheet. This is called secondary protein structure. And when it flattens out into beta pleated sheet configuration, it'll stack up and they'll stick together. They'll have hydrogen bonds, which normally hold it into a slinky configuration. They'll now form in between the separate molecules of fibrinogen clotting protein. And you'll form these big, bulky clots. They're called amyloid clots. When a protein changes secondary protein structure from slinky, you know, alpha helix to beta pleated sheet, that's called an amyloid transformation. So these are amyloid clots. And they tend to be quite irregular. In the articles, there's good papers written on them by Douglas Kell from England and Etheresia praetorius from South Africa. They call them dense matted deposits because they're relative refractory to lysis, meaning that it's hard for the blood to dissolve them. When a molecule precipitates in blood, that's to clot. So they form all these little clots. I actually think this is contributing to the increase in incidence of atrial fibrillation. I also think it's contributing to cognitive decline by plugging up capillaries, you know, in the heart, in the brain, and in other locations. So leaky gut is a significant, important contribution to prothrombogenic factors in the blood. And what is atherosclerosis? Atherosclerosis is a blood clot. That's a really important thing to understand. Just to let you know, too, I did a fellowship in vascular disease, primarily in vascular disease at Harvard back in the 1990s. I've been interested in atherosclerosis for a long time. And I'm actually good friends with one of the greatest pathologists in the world studying atherosclerosis, Dr. Gregory Sloop. And this goes back to the 1800s that it's been known that atherosclerosis is a blood clot. The reason I tell you that is if you understand that atherosclerosis is a blood clot, you can make sense out of it. And I looked at many, many tens of thousands of CT angiograms. You can't, and regular CAT scans, you can't tell atherosclerosis apart from a blood clot because they're the same thing. And that is very informative because it tells you anything that predisposes blood to clot will increase the risk of atherosclerosis. So this amyloid transformation and amyloid clots in your blood, the dense matter deposits, they're making your blood more thrombogenic. Thrombogenic means to clot. So it's a major contributor to atherosclerosis, and most people aren't aware of it. So that's another reason why you want to prevent leaky gut, to reduce your risk of atherosclerosis and to reduce your risk of autoimmune disease. So gut health is really important, and it's sort of another indicator that the old Hippocrates, the ancient Greek guy who said, all disease begins in the gut. Obviously that's an exaggeration, but it's not that far off.
Great. Great. All right. Next question. Some of the doctors and nutritionists from the opposite side, keto carnivore, are making bold claims about benefits of the diets you're promoting. They apparently have research to back those claims up too. You only ever just dismiss those kinds of claims in general and move on. But since it's all very confusing, wouldn't it be more effective if you were to make separate episode video or series about each one of these doctors and debunk every single one of their claims point by point? You could start with the most influential ones and so on. So what's the value in spending your time debunking these guys?
Well, I mean, it's pretty easy to do. And, I'm interested in understanding, complex mechanisms of brain disease, of mitochondrial function, all these advanced things, that I'm like one of the only people in the world can figure out. That interests me, okay? Wallowing in the gutter, with Bart Kay, Gundry, and Ken Berry, that doesn't interest me very much, okay? But, let's just address it for the sake of the question. Actually, there's a good paper written about this by Neil Bernard with Brenda Davis. What are the health issues with paleo keto carnivore diets? We know that high-fat diets stick red blood cells together, rouleau formation, blood sludge. That increases blood pressure. Hypertension is the number one risk factor for stroke. Number two risk factor for atherosclerosis, depending on how you phrase it, okay? So you increase your risk of stroke, of atherosclerosis. They cause tissue hypoxia, going back to the 1950s, Peter Cole paper, by 15 to 20%. Roy Swank said he got up to 30% drop in oxygen delivery to the tissues in a hamster brain. Okay, so what am I saying? Is when you make tissue hypoxic, you increase the risk of it becoming cancerous. It's known that high-fat, high-meat diets increase the risk of cancer, especially animal protein. So you got increased risk of cancer. You got increased risk of hypertension. You got increased risk of diabetes. You have increased risk of atherosclerosis from eating these high-fat diets. Those are like the four big, killers of the Western population. So any diet that increases those things is inherently going to be bad. There's no fiber in animal foods, so you end up constipated. When you're constipated, you strain at the stool more often, get defecation. That's called the Valsalva maneuver. So then you get the back pressure, and you get the abdominal pressure syndrome like Dennis Burkitt described back in the 1960s. You get more diverticulosis, more diverticulitis, more rectal hemorrhoids, more varicoceles in the scrotum, more varicose veins in the leg, periumbilical hernias. The upper stomach pops into the chest. That's a hiatal hernia. Then you get gastroesophageal reflux disease. Then you get increased risk of, esophageal carcinoma. The animal protein in particular has got more sulfur-containing amino acids in it, like methionine. And then the blood has to buffer that pH in the kidneys as well. So you're going to take some calcium from the bone, some from the muscles as well. You're going to excrete it from the kidneys, co-excrete it with hydrogen protons. So you get calciuria, more calcium in the urine. So it predisposes you to kidney stones, to osteoporosis. There's more, but I don't know if there's any point in continuing. And also they die sooner. There's been like 4 longevity studies. They die sooner. So other than being sick, constipated, and having bad breath and dying sooner, I'm not sure what the benefits are. One thing I would say in the short run, why is it that some people can lose weight in the short run? You can get something called the Hawthorne effect, where you're paying, diligent, close attention to something and get good results with any diet in the short run, but it doesn't tend to be sustainable long term. People start to drift back towards a SAD diet or a Mediterranean diet, high-fat diets that are not healthy, and they tend to regain the weight or worse and not do very well.
Great. Okay. I want to take nattokinase for AFib as I have really bad side effects on Eliquis, gone from active to needing a walker to exercise due to severe joint muscle pain and weakness on these meds. I have been whole foods plant-based going on 16 years. I was taking nattokinase twice a day, but did encounter a TIA.
Well, it sounds like encounter a TIA maybe. I would say that what I would say is what you want to do is try to fix everything as much as possible through diet and lifestyle that you can. Sometimes you do need medicines, but I don't want to get into all the pharmacology. That can cause big, long discussions, and this is really sort of focused on nutrition. But for example, I'm 61 years of age. I don't take any pills, none, zero. I'm totally healthy. And I say that because the vast majority of people in the Western civilization, by the time they're 55 or 60, they're hypertensive, pre-diabetic or diabetic, coronary artery disease, a lot of other health problems. And it's characteristic of the low-fat, plant-based populations. They're healthy. They don't get hypertension. They don't get diabetes type 2. They don't get coronary artery disease. So, why wouldn't you want that? Because those are the gateway diseases to cancer and a whole bunch of other problems like we just spoke about, abdominal pressure syndrome. I mean, it's as good a deal as you're going to get. It's sort of like, like the typical person, you tell them, oh, you should eat low-fat vegan. They're like, oh, you're going to make me give up my ice cream, or I love meat and all this other stuff. The proper attitude is, this is all I have to do, and I can avoid these terrible diseases. Thank God. I'll do it. I'll do it. Like Flounder in Animal House. I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. It's a great deal. I mean, it's the best deal you're going to get. The most powerful thing in all the health, most powerful thing I ever learned. I'm triple board. I've been a doctor over 30 years. Most powerful thing I ever learned was starch diet, plant-based diet, vegan, low-fat diet enables you to avoid the chronic Western diseases, which all the patients have. They pretty much almost all of them have the same thing.
Amen. All right. What are your tips to speed up athletic recovery? Is there such a thing as too many antioxidants?
Well, the best way to get your antioxidants is from eating the plants, because then they come packaged the right way. Your body absorbs them the right way. Whenever you put something into a pill, they often have to package it in a way that you probably don't want. A good example of tremendous healing was Ruth Heidrich. She's the great triathlete diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer in her mid-40s. She's still alive. She just had her 90th birthday recently. And she had experienced, she was riding her bike, training for a triathlon. She got hit by a car, and she had a comminuted fracture of her leg, her lower extremity. And they told her she'd never walk again. And she was eating these 2 big bowls of salad every day, as well as a vegan diet, a low-protein vegan diet, too, because she had cancer. She was afraid of higher protein plant foods like beans. Anyway, she healed in a couple of months, was running again. I tell you that because if you eat these low-fat plant-based diets, you'll tend to heal pretty well. If you have a big wound, that's a special circumstance. You might need more protein to heal a big wound, for example, big wound cavity, all this tissue has to regrow. But in general, a lot of times the key thing for a wound is get good blood flow to it. So avoid vasoconstrictors like the sodium. Don't have tension on it, holding. If you want 2 parts of a bone to heal, make sure there's no tension pulling them apart. But those are key things. Avoid medications that would interfere with healing. Things like, NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, aspirin, Motrin, that sort of thing.
Great. Okay. Why do I get gout symptoms when I eat a lot of fruit?
Well, some fruits have lots of fructose, and when you eat a lot of fructose metabolizes different than glucose. When it goes into the liver, the glucose is only metabolized when necessary by the liver, because the liver would rather store it as glycogen. And because it regulates that pretty tight, you don't tend to get fatty liver from that. But what I'm getting at is fructose not like that. Fructose, most of it when you eat it, and the worst is when you eat a fruit, it comes packaged with all the fiber and the antioxidants, and it slows down absorption, and there's not that much fructose in most fruits. But some of the really sweet fruits can be almost like high fructose corn syrup. Not as much, but the fructose goes into the liver, and the initial step, the ATP that phosphorylates it to trap it in the cell, make it polarized so it can't exit back out, that gets converted into uric acid, and that goes into the blood. So if you're eating lots of real sweet fruits, you can get elevated uric acid in the blood, and that can precipitate a gout episode. You'll see papers in literature. If you look it up on PubMed, you'll see papers to that effect as well. And what I've seen with fruits is they don't satisfy hunger as well, and it's almost good to think of them as a treat. Don't get me wrong. I eat about 30% of my calories from fruit, sometimes 35% or so, but I'm pretty active, okay? I'm 61 years of age. I'm pretty active, so it's not a problem for me. A lot of older people, they don't exercise much, and they got to be a little more careful about eating so much fruit. Especially the more sweet ones. But so.
All right. This is a long one. Okay. I've never really had a weight problem before. Small frame with rapid metabolism since childhood, low triglycerides, low LDL, low HGB iron stores prior to being vegan 11 years ago, blood glucose normal, and so on. Looks like I cut out processed, fried junk foods, doing all home cooking, more raw salads, no salad dressings or vegan butter. Occasionally use a small amount of extra virgin avocado oil for some sauteing. A year ago, I quit smoking cigarettes, marijuana, and alcohol, started eating more natural peanut butter, some tahini, less tofu, more potatoes, legumes, and so on. So I've always been routine basmati rice eater with red, yellow lentils. All since quitting above mentioned addictions, I've had a slow and steady weight gain. As a holistic nurse, I knew to expect this, yet it usually tapers off and balances out, as evidence when I quit smoking before. I went through menopause at early 50s, no issues. Now 61, the weight is not leveling as I'd expected. I walk my dogs daily, 45 to an hour. Any suggestions how I can further boost my metabolism, lose weight? 5'3", used to fluctuate between 110 and 120, now 135 and 140. Doesn't feel good. Also having intermittent sciatica. Okay.
Okay, it's a lot of
contact with my
stuff,
family.
but a
Yeah.
couple things I could address. Well, if you want to boost your metabolism, number one, you exercise. Number two, if you think you might have a hypothyroid problem, you can check your thyroid function test. And if you think you do have a mild hypothyroid problem, you can avoid all the goitrogenic foods, things like soy and flax and millet and maybe even the cruciferous vegetables if you want. If you want to get skinny, the lower the percentage of calories from fat, the skinnier the populations are, the skinnier you're probably going to be. You can eat your veggies first, as Chef AJ always recommends, and the other nutrition experts, as a way to stretch your stomach with food that's low caloric density. Oils are 9 calories per gram. Meats, seeds and nuts are like 6 calories per gram. Meats, I think, around 4 calories per gram. Your starches are only 1 calorie per gram because there's a lot of fiber, decreases the density, whereas veggies are like 0.1 calorie per gram. They're the lowest caloric density. So you stretch your stomach, early satisfaction of hunger. The starch also is a polymer of glucose wrapped in fiber, so it takes time for the gut to peel the fiber off. So you get this slow, like a slow release energy pill is the effect of the glucose from the gut being absorbed into the blood. And that keeps your blood glucose in the relatively normal range a prolonged amount of time. Your hunger satisfied with a few number of calories. It makes you skinny. So the next question is, what starches are the lowest in fat? White rice, 1%. Potatoes, 1%. Sweet potatoes, 1%. Those things make you skinny. Look at, China back when they ate tons of rice, and other Asian countries. Like 1 billion out of 1 billion were skinny. Lentils are the skinniest bean, only 3% of calories from fat. Black beans are about 4% of calories from fat. Fruits tend to be very low in percentage of calories from fat. So other than excessive amounts with the fructose, fruit eaters tend to be pretty skinny, especially the young active ones. So those are all things you can do to lose weight. Dr. McDougall said you can raise your veggie intake as high as 50%, but never go higher than that, and you'll lose weight. The more vegetables you eat, the faster you'll lose weight, just because they're so low in caloric density. Don't eat right before you go to bed, even though I still a lot of times do that just because of the convenience of it. But ideally, it would be better to eat earlier in the day. But in real life, most of us have to get up and work all day long. And I don't want to wake up earlier to eat because then I would lose sleep. And even on my day off, your academic time is best first thing in the morning. And I don't want to give that up. After you eat, your IQ kind of drops. You got blood diverted to your gut and you're distracted more easily and whatnot. So anyways, those are some things. Hopefully it'll help.
I mean, when I look at this, what jumps out at me is extra virgin avocado oil. Stop. More natural peanut butter. Stop. Tahini. No tahini. Tofu. No tofu. It's like the study that I mentioned at the beginning of this. Yes, they added a little bit of fat, but they didn't do as well as the one that did the McDougall Maximum Weight Loss Program, which didn't have any added fats or nuts and that sort of thing. And those people lost 20 pounds in 12 weeks. The people who had some fat in this new study in Slovakia, they lost 15 pounds in the same amount of time. But I mean, these things add up when you're putting a little oil, a little tahini, a little better, more natural peanut butter. No, you're not getting it. If you want to lose the weight in the way that Dr. McDougall recommends and Dr. Rogers, you just cut that stuff out. Find a way to eat. You can sequence your meals. You can have a soup first. You can find ways to, kind of get filled up and eat your starches last, as you go. Also, the smoothies, I would say don't drink your calories. It's too easy to drink a lot of calories and not really be that satisfied. Eat your foods, but pick up a copy of Maximum Weight Loss. That's Peter Rogers diet right there. Okay. There's too much little stuff going on here that's going to contribute, in my opinion. If you want to lose weight, you got to cut that stuff. Period. End of subject. Here we go. Being on a low-fat and oil vegan diet, how can I increase my ferritin levels without increasing iron consumption? I've been diagnosed with genetic hemochromatosis and manage high iron retention levels with biannual blood donations. I cannot seem to get my ferritin iron absorption into an acceptable range. It's been around 25 for the past year, where my hematologist suggests ideal level is 50 to 100.
Yeah, it depends what you read for what's an ideal ferritin level. I've heard other authors recommend ideal ferritins in the ballpark of 25 or 30 to 80. And if you get below 25, you can get tingling, you can get restless leg syndrome. One thing you could do is donate less blood, depending on what your total iron levels are, to donate less blood. Like, for example, if I go to have a blood test to check my cholesterol or something, I'll have them pull off like 4 tubes because I want to get my serum ferritin a little lower. Women are the ones that tend to have things like iron deficiency anemia from menstruation. Most men are iron overloaded in the Western world after 25 years of age. Women typically tend to start becoming iron overloaded, about 5-10 years after they stop menstruating. But when they're menstruating, some of them, they're kind of low in iron. If you got hemochromatosis, that means your body is hanging on to the iron more than it should. So you could donate less blood. If you're symptomatic and you're really worried about your ferritin, that's one thing you could do. Because as long as you're asymptomatic, though, I would maybe just be okay with that 25 if everything else was good. Because what you want to avoid is, having the real high ferritins and being at increased risk for cirrhosis and whatnot.
Okay, what are the main arguments that could be made to convince carnivores and keto, who often ridicule vegan diet, that they're putting their long-term health at risk with their diet? You sort of reviewed these a minute ago, right?
Yeah.
You went through, so see that answer that has a lot. I'm 81, 25 years ago, I weighed 240 pounds. 10 years ago, I became strict vegan. I now weigh 125 and I'm quite skinny. My weight is about where I was when I was in junior high. Are there any problems with being so skinny? My family thinks I should put on some weight, but I feel great. If I should add weight, how would you recommend doing so?
Yeah, we kind of talked about this, but I'll say one other thing I forgot to mention earlier is we recently talked about, you gave a lecture about cysteine, and we talked about also that lecture coming out of James Mitchell over at the Buchinger-Wellheime Clinic. And he said
that's a great lecture.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you read a
maybe I'll add it to the description again in case people have missed it, because you posted it as a comment, Peter, and that's the first time I saw it, the guy at Harvard. I'm going to put it in the description after this because it's such an interesting talk. Go ahead, continue.
Yeah, what he mentioned was, the main job of the liver is to provide glucose to the brain during fasting. So the liver stores glycogen in the daytime after meals, and then at night while you're fasting, it breaks down the glycogen, releases the glucose in the meal, makes sure the brain has enough glucose, okay? If there's a relative lack of glycogen in the liver still has to come up with a way to get more glucose into the blood to make sure the brain has what it needs, okay? So the liver will actually take protein from the body and it'll convert the amino acids into glucose. That's called gluconeogenesis. But if you're relatively low in protein in your diet and there's not a lot of excess protein available, the liver will burn fat. What it does is your fat is made out of triglycerides. So there's a backbone with 3 carbons on it. Imagine these are 3 carbons, 1, 2, 3. And we'll make this the backbone of glycerol. And it's kind of like a propane triol, a 3-carbon molecule. Imagine there's 1, 2, 3 carbons, and then there's 1, 2, 3 fatty acids on it. That's a triglyceride. So the fatty acids right here, the body has no use for those. It'll burn those as fat. You can even send them to white adipose tissue and burn those as fat. But the glycerol, the 3-carbon molecule, that gets sent to your liver. And then your liver takes that 3-carbon molecule, combines it with another 3-carbon molecule, converts it into glucose. That's called gluconeogenesis, using glycerol, the backbone of triglycerides. And it'll make that into glucose for the brain. But it just burned the fat. So why am I going through all this? The point is, eating a low-protein diet can help you to lose weight because you're going to mobilize more fat for gluconeogenesis. And he felt that Kepner's work had shown this. His research had shown that. And I do think it's good to keep your diets low in protein. I think this whole, fad of recommending higher protein for old people, I don't think that is correct. I don't think that's legitimate. Dr. McDougall's talked about this at some length as well. Breast milk only has about 5 or 6% of calories from fat. From protein at the time we need it the most because we're most rapidly growing. The Papua New Guinea ate 93% of their calories from sweet potatoes. That's only 4.5% of calories from protein. They're strong, muscular, athletic, and energetic. So this whole, you need protein, I think that's totally overrated.
Yep. Okay. Hi, in November 2024, I weighed nearly 300 pounds. My blood showed an HbA1c of 48, diabetic cholesterol of 5.5, triglycerides of 2. I then started a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. I'm currently down to 230 pounds. In March, I had repeat blood tests and my HbA1c went down to 41 normal, but to my surprise, cholesterol went up to 6.1, triglycerides to 3.8. Is this because my body is using up the fat? Is it possible I've tanked my thyroid from calorie deficit? Please let me know what I can do to get the cholesterol and triglycerides down.
Okay, so what I think is happening here is as you're losing the weight kind of rapidly, the fat exits the fat cells and it travels through your blood. So if you simultaneously then do a blood draw, you're going to find hyperlipidemia, high fats in your blood. But I think that's just because they're being mobilized as they're being excreted from your body. You know, if you're worried about being hypothyroid, you can check with thyroid function tests. But it's normal that your total cholesterol is going to go up, especially your LDL cholesterol is going to go up during a time of rapid weight loss. So that's probably what it is. You know, you're making progress in the sense your hemoglobin A1C is continuing to go down. It's a sign, you know, you're having less insulin resistance.
Great. Okay, next question. Thank you, Jeff. What a combo. My favorite, lost 110 pounds going whole food plant-based 6 years ago, no oil, sugar, salt. I'm 68 on 0 prescription. I want to lose another 10 pounds, but having a hard time. I exercise also 10 miles a day average on my bike. I was 253 down to 145. Please help me shed the last 10.
Yeah, and it's like we just said, we've pretty much gone through all this stuff, you know, already. And like you said in the last one, you're minimize the fat.
Yeah, tighten your game. I don't know. We don't have information. I mean, no oil, no sugar, no salt sounds like someone who's pretty serious. That's more serious than me. I do have a little bit of that stuff, but okay. So here we go. Glaucoma, had eye issues since birth and trying to hold on to the vision that I have. Glaucoma?
Yeah, glaucoma is especially associated with hypertension, but you want to avoid anything else that could worsen your eye function. Okay, so, you know, I went through them a moment ago. You know, C-Dog is how I remember them. Cataract, diabetes, age-related macular degeneration, hypertension, and G for glaucoma. So dairy is a big thing associated with cataract. What I'm trying to say is if you're already losing vision due to glaucoma, you want to avoid anything else that could cause you to lower vision. Make sure you're not doing anything that puts you at risk for eye trauma. Make sure you're not at any risk for something that causes you to get radiation to your eye. For example, I'll see these speech therapists doing the cookie swallows on the older patients who've had a stroke to make sure they're not aspirating when they eat. And they often get more radiation exposure to themselves than they should. So one, if you have to work around radiation, be very careful for it. Don't do things that might give some radiation to your eye if you can avoid it. You know, some people go for dental x-rays too often, in my opinion. Avoid anything that's going to cause eye trauma. Optimize all the parameters of your vascular health with a low fat, low sodium vegan diet with no oil. You know, the same things that prevent hypertension, prevent diabetes, and prevent atherosclerosis. Those will help protect your eye function. And that should help you to hang on to your eyes for a long time. I'll tell you one quick story. I used to work primarily as an imaging guided surgeon, interventional radiologist. So I would have to work with radiation, doing all kinds of procedures. I've done about 10,000 surgical procedures. And I, you know, had a little bit of trauma playing sports. I used to play football and all that kind of stuff. But I went to the eye doctor when I was in my 30s. And he looked at my eyes. He said, you know, Pete, you got bilateral cataracts. I was in my 30s. All right. And I'm like, oh, that sucks. You know, maybe it was radiation induced from working with all the operations. But, you know, it was right around that time when I switched to becoming a vegan. I actually switched to becoming more primarily a neuroradiologist. I still do some imaging guided surgery. I still do some general diagnostic radiology and related things. I still do a lot of coaching and nutrition. But I stopped doing the imaging guided surgery as much as I used to. Anyways, and then I became a vegan at that time, a vegetarian at that time, about 22 years ago, and 100% vegan now for about 6 years, a little more than that. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is I've had no change in my eyeglass prescriptions. None, zero. And I think it's because I got my act together just in time before I had significant irreversible damage. I had some damage, and I have to wear glasses when I drive, but not for anything else. But so what I'm trying to say is you probably could preserve it, but just, you know, do everything as well as you can from here on out.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to ask questions. Respect and admire commitment. Okay, that's just a thank you. If a person has low hemoglobin and low red blood cell count, couldn't that give you a false high blood sugar reading?
Yeah, if you're doing like point of care blood glucose testing and you just take a little dropout, it sort of goes by the whole blood, and the low hemoglobin could affect that. If you do a blood test where they take blood out of your system, like a venous blood draw, you'll get a more accurate measurement of your blood glucose, and it could be relevant. You can also get a falsely elevated hemoglobin A1C, thinking you have diabetes when maybe you don't. So it can be relevant to correlate the two. You can check it under both conditions, work with your endocrinologist to get that figured out. Because the danger is if you're overestimating your blood glucose level, you might overestimate the amount of insulin you're going to give to treat it. So, and the other question is, why are you anemic? Okay, if it's a woman, the first thing you think of is it her menstrual cycle? She gets older, is it because she has fibroids? But you always got in the back of your mind, make sure that it's not something more significant. It's not due to, blood loss from the colon with colon cancer. Okay, do you need endoscopy if that's the case? So you want to figure out why you're anemic and see if there's anything you can do to correct that.
Okay. Since the second COVID shot, I've had many difficult side effects, tachycardia and neuropathy, headaches. But one thing really plagues me. I can't get rid of staph infection on my leg. I had this infection for years, but usually would completely disappear for months on end. No scars, no evidence it even existed until I ate the wrong kind of sugar. And the drafted whatever had 25 sores, huge with dermatitis. It never goes away now. There's so many fake sugars used now. Even Japanese restaurants use it in their pickled ginger. I've been to a dermatologist, no results. So I guess it's a sugar question.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a sugar question. First of all, I would avoid all the sugar substitutes. They're all bad. They're all either prothrombotic or brain excitotoxins like aspartame, or stevia even potentially can make people infertile. They're all bad. So you want to avoid all of that stuff. They confuse your body's taste system and hunger control center and your pancreas. That's number one. Number two, we talked about healing anything. For anything in your body, you want it to work, you want to have good blood flow. How do you get good blood flow? You avoid the high amounts of fat. You avoid the high amounts of sodium. You avoid the high amounts of uric acid. And also you want to prevent leaky gut so you don't get the amyloid type of clotting, the dense matted deposits. So if you get good blood flow to the tissue, your immune system is much more likely then to be able to adequately heal the wound. Because high-fat diets, they also suppress immune function. There's a lady by the name of Lydia Lynch, Irish lady. She used to be at Harvard. Now she's at Princeton. She has a real good lecture on the subject over at Global Immunotalks. That's a YouTube channel, Global Immunotalks, about how the high-fat diets and also the person being obese, because they're going to release more lipid into the blood, those will diminish immune function. There's another interesting guy. His name's Luke O'Neill. He's an Irish guy, and he has a lecture over at Global Immunotalks, okay? And what he talks about is how the mitochondrial function is so essential to the immune system to function. And the reason I mention that is a lot of people are unknowingly exposed to multiple mitochondrial inhibitors, and that is decreasing the function of their immune system, the function of their brain, and the function of their heart. I know that, for example, saturated fat inhibits like complex 3 of the inner mitochondrial membrane, and Michael Brownlee wrote the great paper about that, like the all-time greatest diabetes paper. It's called Unifying Theory of Diabetic Complications. He won the Banting Award in 2004. All right, so that's explaining how that's a mechanism of causing insulin resistance in diabetes. And the reason that's relevant is other things that inhibit the inner mitochondrial membrane electron transport, they're going to potentially increase your chance of diabetes. A good example would be statins. Statins are a medication that inhibits like coenzyme Q level electron transport, and they also increase your risk of diabetes. So you're getting some benefit by lowering your cholesterol, but you're also creating a new problem of increased problems with your mitochondria and increased risk of diabetes. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is if you want to heal, you want everything in your body working as well as possible. So you want to avoid these inner mitochondrial membrane inhibitors. Well, what else does it? Atrazine, that's sprayed on corn on the non-organic food. So you don't want to be eating that. That's used for all the high fructose corn syrup. Glyphosate is also an inner mitochondrial membrane inhibitor. I think that's complex 2. All right, so you don't want that. That's sprayed on the non-organic soy. Glyphosate is sprayed on 70 other crops. That's why I only eat organic. Tons of medications. I found about 70 of them. There was 0 in my college biochemistry textbooks, my medical school biochemistry textbooks, my nutrition biochemistry textbook, like Gropper. Okay, nothing. Then I started going through the literature because I knew I had to find a whole bunch more. I quickly found 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 70 mitochondrial inhibitors. A lot of people are walking around on 10, 15, 20 mitochondrial inhibitors, and they wonder why are they tired, they have no energy, they can't heal their wounds. Well, there's your answer right there. So I would go through those and make sure you're avoiding them. A lot of them are common medications. Some of them are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, Plavix, antiplatelet drug, metformin, a very common diabetes treatment drug, lots of the common antibiotics, fluoroquinolones, beta-lactam penicillins, tetracyclines, and a lot of the other blood drugs too, like for hypertension as well. Some of these beta blockers, these psych meds are often mitochondrial inhibitors, tricyclic antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antipsychotics. So I tell you all these things. So your immune cells have to function well. And by getting good blood flow to the tissue, avoiding mitochondrial inhibitors, avoiding vasoconstrictors, you got a better chance your immune system can function well and can heal the wound.
Lovely. There we go. What about SIBO? For some reason, many people are diagnosed with and going full on a high-carb food mat diet makes them sicker. Obviously, answer is treat them before. But do you have any experience with this? Also, what about low stomach acid versus hyperchlorhydria?
Yeah, I don't myself treat SIBO that much. It's sort of more in the territory of a gastroenterologist, and that guy, Dr. B. Bolshevitz, is a pretty smart guy. What he says about it is it's good to feed the patients a plant-based, high-fiber diet because when they get adequate dietary fiber, the good gut bacteria tend to take over and fix the problems because SIBO means small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Normally, you have very few bacteria in your stomach or your small intestine, but tons of them in your colon. So it's an abnormal situation to have more in your small intestine. You can try to diagnose it with something called a breath test, but it's not very accurate. You can even do something called a sterile jejunal aspirate through an endoscope, but that's very difficult to do, and almost no one does it. Dr. B says he doesn't do it himself even. So you end up quite often just treating them prospectively to see what you're going to get. And he made the comment kind of funny, be careful about going to antibiotics right in the beginning because the antibiotics themselves might sort of wipe out your good gut bacteria and cause your bad gut bacteria to proliferate and give you SIBO. So even if you don't have it, you've been misdiagnosed, you could give it to yourself. So why not eat the healthy plant-based high-fiber diet and give that a chance, and see if you heal from that. That's what I would do. I know Dr. McDougall gave a lecture on it. I haven't seen it, so I don't remember the details of it, but he did some type of lecture on that where he was talking to his friend Gustavo. I don't remember Gustavo's last name, but Gustavo, Hispanic guy.
Right. Yeah. South American guy. Okay. So many people pushing pseudoscience. Yes. Welcome to the internet. Dr. Rogers, do you use some sort of toothpaste? You don't recommend fluoride, but do other toothpastes contain other chemicals that should be avoided? What about baking soda?
Yeah, it's hard to win with toothpaste. There's so many harmful chemicals in there, from the fluoride to the sodium lauryl sulfate. They used to put carrageenan in a lot of them. They used to put triclosan in them. I do sometimes brush my teeth, though, just because, I activated a cavity one time when I experimented with that sugar diet. That was a mistake. And so I'll brush my teeth sometimes right afterwards. So I'll sometimes guzzle down beet juice to hydrate myself. I like to guzzle down beet juice before a big workout. It gives me a lot of energy. I'll guzzle down like 32 ounces of beet juice, chase it with about, 8 to 12 ounces of reverse osmosis water. And then I'll brush my teeth right afterwards. And I'll use one of those brands of toothpaste with no fluoride in it. Tom's of Maine is reasonable, but there's no great toothpaste that I'm aware of. And some of them come in a container that looks like aluminum. So what are you brushing your teeth with something that's got aluminum on it? They're all in otherwise a plastic container. So I'm not aware of a great one, but I do use one of the non-fluoride ones from Tom's of Maine is what I do.
Here's what I use.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Which is that one. They're called Hello, but who knows? So, all right, on to the next one. This looks like another long one. Yeah, this is probably too long to read. So much detail.
Yeah, that's like a pharmaceutical one. It's all drugs. I don't want to start getting into telling her doctor.
Yeah, it's just a 96-year-old patient, but it's just so many drugs. It just would take quite a while to go through that.
I already talked about what was the problem that she had. did she stroke or she fell or something?
Yeah, ischemic stroke 8 years ago, clot to the brain, hospital admission, 45 minutes of the stroke, full recovery, current medication.
I get it. Yeah. So basically, a stroke, the bottom line is in the center of the stroke. Imagine this pinpoint here. My marker is the stroke center, and that's dead brain. That's called the core infarct. Around it is what you would call my hand. That's the penumbra. That's the adjacent brain tissue, which also had compromised circulation, but it's not dead. So you want to optimize all your vascular health habits and risk factors so that you maintain perfusion of the penumbra. Because if you lose perfusion of the penumbra, it'll all be dead, and you'll end up with a big infarct of the size of my entire fist is stroked out brain. So it's just good habits. What does that mean? Low-fat diet, low sodium, 100% vegan, no oil, no processed food, no cigarettes, no marijuana, no head trauma. Get your sleep. Avoid caffeine.
Great. Okay. So next question. It's up here somewhere. I have a question. 39-year-old vegan woman, consistent low ferritin. Is this the same person? No. Symptoms such as fatigue and tingling in hands, feet. With supplements, I managed to get it slightly higher. Seems to be stuck at 20. I've been offered iron infusion. Are these safe? Is it worth it for me to have this if my only symptoms now are fatigue and tingling?
Yeah, it's a little bit similar to what we spoke about before. She feels her serum ferritin is too low, and she is below 25. She's down at 20, and she does have symptoms which they think are due to it, this tingling and whatnot. And again, they can get restless legs, for example. I would, first of all, try to fix it if at all possible by diet. Anytime you get an IV medication, that's a more serious thing, more higher risk of side effect. In my experience, most patients are not very afraid of medicines. They're not very afraid of surgery. I'm totally afraid of medicines and surgery. I've seen tons of complications. And so patients always assume everything's going to be fine. It might be fine. You might be just fine. But what I'm saying is I would experiment around with diet and try to fix it as much as you can. And, I'm 100% vegan, but I'm not one of those animal rights people. I would rather eat meat than have an IV infusion or something. If it was up to me, if I had to have a hamburger once a week, I would do red meat. I would do that before I would have an IV infusion, me personally.
All right. Well, that says something. What do you think about Gregor's habit to constantly walk?
Oh, yeah. And one last thing, getting back to that, I would try to fix it by eating plant foods first. But I'm just saying.
She is vegan. She says she's vegan.
Yeah, I would try to fix it in that way. But I'm just trying to say I think it's wise to be afraid of unnecessary procedures if you can. Okay, so what do I think of Dr. Gregor walking a lot? I think that's good. He's got a treadmill desk. I think that's a good thing.
And I know the story behind that, frankly, and this was some years ago. I think he was putting on a little extra weight that he was concerned about, and he talked to someone I know who's an exercise specialist kind of guy, and that's the person who recommended he get the treadmill and start walking to burn those extra calories. And to me, this comes down again to the little study that I talked about at the beginning, where they were having, nuts, regular nuts and seeds and things like that, flax or whatever, that they were adding daily, like, this is important for your health. And I know Dr. Gregor is very high on nuts, and he talks about that nut industry funded research that he loves to push, like there's some magical food. And I think that what happened was he was eating a good diet, but he feels these nuts are important. And when you're eating nuts every day, if you're eating an ounce of nuts, you're eating, depending on the nut, somewhere between 160 or 220 extra calories. And if you're doing that 7 days a week, that's an extra 1,400 calories maybe that you're adding to your diet. And over time, you're going to put on a little extra pound. And then at the end of the year, you might have put on a couple of more pounds and so on. And that's just underscores for me that when they did the broad study in New Zealand, where they followed the McDougall Maximum Weight Loss Program, which is the program where you're not going to add nuts, you're not going to have avocados, you're not going to have these, one handful of nuts or whatever it is, 1 ounce of nuts, that you don't have to exercise. You don't have to get on the treadmill. Hey, the treadmill is great. I go running 5 days a week or something, so I'm not at all down on exercise. But it just underscores for me that the ideal weight diet is going to be one that really is not adding nuts, not adding, that kind of stuff. So that's Dr. Gregor. That's how he got on that. And now all day long, he's on his treadmill. That's great. He can eat more nuts. Okay.
Yeah, I also want to add one thing about exercise. I've been reading a lot about mitochondrial physiology, And mitochondria will go through episodes where they're not functioning well for whatever the reason, inhibitors, or they're having more oxidative stress. And you'll damage some of your mitochondrial DNA. And they go through something called mitophagy, where they try to get rid of the bad mitochondria, keep the good ones. And what I'm saying is, when you exercise on a routine basis, preferably at least some every day, I think you should try to walk at least 2 hours in total, not all at once, 2 hours continuous, but throughout the day, 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. Try to get about 2 hours of walking or more every day. Your body's like use it or lose it. You've got resources that are limited. So if you don't make your body exercise every day, or at least every other day or so, your body starts to say, why should we maintain all these mitochondria? We don't really need them. All right. Versus when you exercise more and raise the intensity, you'll make more mitochondria. Now, you can overdo it. Most people, they can't handle running a marathon. I know some people handle it quite well, but what I'm saying is just do some type of motion every day, because otherwise you will lose it. I wrestled in college, but I can't wrestle anymore. I don't have the fitness level to wrestle anymore. I lost that fitness level. Whereas I got friends that kept going, like my brother, and he still does. He's almost my age. And so what I'm trying to say is, you want to maintain high levels of physical fitness and activity. Otherwise, you'll lose it. You'll age much better.
Right. And that's where high intensity, I think, comes into play. Running is great. Walking is great. But if you go out and you sprint one day a week, or you do something really hard, even in small bursts, that can have big payoff, I believe. Okay, if a person has a bunch of risk factors for heart disease, like family history, obesity, smoking, inactivity, and diabetes, but don't have high cholesterol, then plaques don't form, correct? How does that work? High cholesterol is required to form the plaques?
Okay, well, there is a guy by the name of William Roberts. He was that cardiac pathologist from Texas, did all those autopsy studies on patients who died of heart attacks. And he's a bright guy. And he used to lecture that the most important thing you need for a heart attack and have atherosclerosis is to have elevated blood cholesterol. But I don't quite think that's correct. For example, you can be a 15-year-old with sickle cell anemia and have a heart attack due to a blood clot. Any cause of a blood clot can plug up an artery. Okay, so I think that's exaggerated. Also, if you look at, strokes, the number one risk factor is hypertension, and that includes for ischemic strokes too. And I've given lectures in other previous lectures where I showed the slide how when you have elevated blood pressure, the systolic pressure comes up at a higher speed. It hits the median divider, for example, between the external carotid, all the branches to the face, internal carotid going up to the brain. And when it hits that median divider, it bounces off, causing more turbulent flow, chaotic flow, more slow retrograde eddy currents. Those confuse the endothelium, the lining of the adjacent artery on the far wall. It sheds its antithrombotic glycocalyx, and then which is about 600 nanometers high. And then beneath that, there's these prothrombotic molecules like VCAM, vascular cell adhesion molecule. They're only about 60 nanometers high. And then red blood cells can stick to them, form a clot. That's the beginning of an atherosclerotic plaque. So what I'm trying to say is you can get atherosclerosis without having high cholesterol. You usually in the Western world certainly going to have high cholesterol, but look at all the Japanese people. They get a lot of strokes back in the 1960s, for example, because they were smoking a lot of cigarettes and they're putting like 12 to 14 grams of sodium on their food. And that they used to call that Asian atherosclerosis, intracranial atherosclerosis, versus Western atherosclerosis was especially in the coronaries, but to some large extent also in the carotids, internal carotid arteries. So what I'm saying is atherosclerosis is not just cholesterol. Cholesterol is the number one risk factor. I'll call hypertension risk factor number 2, but there's plenty of other risk factors. Like I was just talking about, being sedentary, being excessively stressed out, having leaky gut with the amyloid clotting, diabetes makes your blood prothrombotic, for example. Anything that inhibits endothelial nitric oxide, the dietary sodium, for example, the uric acid, for example, they're all atherosclerosis risk factors.
Okay, so how should one prioritize sleep, food, and exercise, especially focusing too much on one, like exercising more or following a strict diet, leads to poor sleep, overeating, or burnout? Is there a sustainable balance without trying to optimize everything at once?
Yeah, well, I'd say, diet and sleep are probably the two most important things. So you have to work out a plan for that. We've got diet figured out, low fat, low sodium, vegan, no oil, like we just spoke about. For sleep, usually the thing is go to bed earlier, avoid unnecessary stress, avoid caffeine, that sort of thing.
Great. Dr. Rogers, 67-year-old woman that's been vegan for 30 years, have followed a starch-based whole foods diet for many years, but find that I can't lose the last 10 pounds. I eat lots of fruit, lots of vegetables, beans, and starches. I haven't been having any nuts, seeds, and avocado. I work out every morning, doing an hour brisk walk, weights 3 mornings a week, dance class, water aerobics. your recommendation.
Yeah, it's kind of like what we already talked about. Go through all your foods and minimize the percentage of fats, and then do the other things we talked about if you want. You know, start with the veggies, eat lower caloric density, all that stuff.
Doke. Would love Dr. Rogers' opinion on the now very popular sugar diet, where people basically eat only fruit juice, added sugars. They say it boosts their metabolism. They can eat thousands of calories a day. Is having a faster metabolism beneficial for any reason? Would it make weight loss easier if we boosted our metabolism by this method and then return to starch-based approach again?
Okay, and also I wanted to add one last thing to the last thing about fat. And this question is kind of a continuation of another reason why you don't want to add salt to your food is it does taste good and you eat more of it. I'm also not a big fan of adding salt because it could have microplastics in it. It could have aluminum in it, for example. Plus, whenever you eat a processed food, they often put MSG or MFG in there, monosodium glutamate, manufacturer-free glutamate. And that stuff makes food taste really good, but you'll tend to overeat it for those reasons. So that's another reason I don't eat any processed food, none whatsoever. Now, as far as the sugar diet, this has become a big trend of the moment. And there's this guy, gosh, what's his name? He's kind of funny. I know he's friends with Mark Bell. And he's the guy who got kicked off the internet. He went viral with he swears all the time and he walks around. He's kind of funny, like the Energizer Bunny, swearing and talking about the sugar diet. And so, yes, it's entertaining, but I'm not a big fan of eating straight sugar. You got a lot of fructose in there, but not just that. You can reactivate a cavity. I reactivated a cavity, and that's kind of annoying. So now I have to floss my teeth extra, brush my teeth more often than I used to. And so I've got the cavity back under control. It's not symptomatic or bothering me anymore, but I don't want to reactivate my cavities, okay? There's other issues with excessive simple sugars. Dr. Bolshevitz, Dr. B talks a lot about, in his opinion, it's a significant contributor to leaky gut. I just don't think simple sugar is that smart of a way to go, especially make sure it's organic. If it's not organic, it might have glyphosate sprayed on the beets. That'll increase your risk of fatty liver and problems like that. I do know there are some skinny guys. Even I know that guy, Durian Ryder. He's kind of entertaining and he's real skinny, but, you know, I don't know how much he's taking anabolic steroids, if he does that anymore. Also, what else was about that guy? He exercises. I don't know what he does. I know he coaches people that compete in bicycle races and running races. He's very athletic. And, you know, I like him. I think he's entertaining and funny. But, you know, most people, we don't have a nice job in a tropical country. You know, we live in USA. It's cold in the winter and we got to spend our entire day practically in the office. So, you know, it's a little harder when you live under those conditions to stay real slim if you're eating lots of sweets. I don't think it's the best thing. So anyways.
Okay, next, Dr. Rogers is diagnosed with primary biliary cholangitis. A year and a half ago, went plant-based after getting diagnosed, seeing very little results. Anything I can do, anything else? My liver doctor said there's nothing that I can do and I should just take meds.
Yeah, primary biliary cholangitis is like the same thing as primary biliary cirrhosis. It's thought to often be an autoimmune disease. So the first thing I would do is I would avoid everything that causes autoimmune disease. I just gave a lecture recently, you know, within the past month or two here on Veg Source about autoimmune disease. I would avoid all that stuff. Do everything you could to prevent leaky gut, everything you could to prevent periodontal disease in your mouth. Because you get periodontal disease, then you start getting the same type of problem. Gram-negative bacteria, LPS endotoxin, gram-positive bacteria, LTA endotoxin, getting into your blood, being prothrombotic, pro-inflammatory, increasing the risk of autoimmune disease, okay? And you can get molecular mimicry to the animal protein, all that stuff. So I would avoid all that stuff. I would avoid volatile organic compounds. You know, anything that smells bad is bad for you and potentially will increase your risk of these diseases. A lot of those things are also SERCA inhibitors. I would avoid all the mitochondrial inhibitors. Your immune system will function better. I would avoid all the estrogenic chemicals. I've given lectures on that before, especially like in the context of, you know, cancer, like because they increase the risk of breast cancer as well. They increase the risk of prostate cancer. There's tons of them. There's estrogenic chemicals in your drinking water. So you want to filter your drinking water at least with a carbon filter. You know, being organic, you can remove them with a carbon filter. Ideally for your kitchen sink, you should also have reverse osmosis. So if you minimize your exposure, the reason is all these estrogenic chemicals, they make the immune system function a little bit erratic. Women get 80% of autoimmune disease. So you don't want all these extra estrogenic chemicals on board. And once you've kind of got everything optimized like that, you might stop progressing your autoimmune disease. at the very least, you won't damage your liver for any other reason. I would certainly eat 100% organic. You don't want to be eating anything with glyphosate sprayed on it, which is toxic to the liver. You don't want anything else toxic to the liver. You don't want Tylenol. You don't want rooibos tea. You don't want anything that could damage your liver. So that if any damage occurs, let it be from the process in place, the PBC, and not from anything new that you're doing to contribute to it.
Great. I have a close friend who's dealing with post-stroke recovery. Since her stroke, she has slowly declined in regards to her motor control. One side of her body developed the shakes about 3 months post-stroke and has continued to get worse over time. Is there a way to resolve this? I pointed her to your direction. I've spoken specifically about my beliefs that due to continued inflammation. She eats clean, but still eats animal protein, has occasional dairy, etc.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, don't say she eats clean. I hate when people say that. It's like, what are you talking about? Just mean that it's a whole food. It's, and then she says she eats clean. And then right afterwards follows it with, animal protein and dairy. Those are very unclean foods in one sense, you could say. Okay, yeah, you don't want to eat anything from an animal. Nothing, zero. And we kind of talked about this earlier, healing anything and maintaining the penumbra around the core infarcted dead brain of stroke. So you want to keep good blood flow to that penumbra. And by avoiding blood-brain barrier, the same butyrate. So you have the dietary fiber, good gut bacteria, make that into short-chain fatty acid butyrate. That butyrate from the fiber goes through your intestinal lining. They maintain the tight junctions like we talked about. In addition, the butyrate, there's some left over. It goes into the blood and it travels up to your brain. The butyrate is used by the blood-brain barrier to also make tight junctions. You got the same sort of thing in the brain, tight junctions between the endothelial cells. That's your blood-brain barrier. So if you don't eat enough dietary fiber, you're also predisposed to have a leaky blood-brain barrier, which allows toxins from the gut, like this LPS and LTA, bacterial endotoxins, to get access to your brain. Once they get into your brain, you've got guard cells in your brain called, macrophages. They're called microglia specifically. And the guard cells will bind with that. Everything's by Braille. They feel everything. They'll feel the LPS, they'll feel the LTA, and they go, bacterial invasion in the brain. Okay, we gotta sterilize this area, clear the way, and they'll release all these toxic chemicals, and that will cause collateral damage to the adjacent brain cells. So what I'm saying is, by preventing leaky gut, you prevent leaky blood-brain barrier, and you prevent overactivation of your microglia. Plus, when you overactivate your microglia, you're putting them into a sensitized activated mode, and they're much more likely to overreact to any little problem that might arise. You don't want that, because that can cause a low-grade brain inflammation, neuroinflammation, that'll lead to decreased cognitive function. So you don't want that. The same diet, the reason why is it that one diet, this low-fat vegan diet, makes you healthy in so many different ways? And it's because it's the optimal diet for humans, okay? I realize in the wild populations, people would eat a little bit of meat. Yeah, and I think that's just the way nature was. But I think in the modern world, most people ate the SAD diet for much of their younger age, or a poor version of the Mediterranean diet. And in a sense, they're trying to detox and they're trying to slow down aging. And so this is the optimal way to go. The only thing you need to take if you're low-fat vegan for a long amount of time is some vitamin B12. I take methylcobalamin for that.
All right, here we go. My daughter has elevated liver enzymes post-delivery. Never had this before and or during pregnancy. What should she do to decrease these levels back to normal range? What would even cause this post-delivery?
Yeah, so, most people, the reason they have elevated liver function tests is because they're eating high-fat diets, high fructose in the processed food, and they get a fatty liver, okay? As a matter of fact, I can tell you, if I see patient's history, elevated LFTs, liver function tests, I don't even need to look at the films. I know if they get an ultrasound of the liver, it's going to be fatty liver. It virtually always is. Almost all the patients with kidney stones also have a fatty liver. Okay. However, being pregnant is a weird situation. It's a very unique situation. There's additional things a pregnant woman could have. They can get something called cholestasis of pregnancy. They can get something called HELP syndrome, hepatic elevated liver function tests, and low platelets, and they could have bleeding problems, etc. Delivering the baby can help with that. So what I'm trying to say is this is a really specialized question. She needs to work that out with her gynecologist, OB-GYN doctor, to see if she has any of these pregnancy-related diseases. And if it's not a pregnancy-related rare disease, then you start thinking about the garden variety stuff like we just talked about. Is it the usual fatty liver or something along those lines?
Dr. Rogers, in the years after radiation treatment for prostate cancer 2022, can you explain the, quote, painless rectal bleeding that GI docs say will come and go as a result of the radiation? Can anything be done nutritionally to reduce the bleeding?
Yeah, so the prostate is located right in front of the rectum, and so it's in the field of the X-ray beam for radiation therapy for the prostate. Radiation tends to devascularize a tissue, and it can cause other irregularities of the blood vessels. And so that can lead to chronic low-grade intestinal bleeding. And that's, sounds like that's what the patient has. So, for anything in the body, how do you heal anything? Try to improve the blood flow, avoid vasoconstrictors, avoid the high-fat diets, just like we talked about. That's how you optimize blood flow and anything. Eat your plant-based food, get plenty of greens. Make sure you're not interrupting your nitric oxide pathway. Don't be brushing your teeth with fluoride or using a mouthwash that wipe out the bacteria in the back of the tongue that convert the nitrates to nitrites, and then don't be taking a proton pump inhibitors or something, an acid blocker that blocks the next step of the pathway to go from nitrite NO2 to NO, nitric oxide, systemic vasodilator. Get some sunshine. Your dietary fiber will prevent you from being less constipated. You'll strain less at the stool. That might decrease the bleeding a little bit. You can monitor that by checking your blood hemoglobin periodically, but I don't know if you're going to do much better than that. That you're chronically got a partially devascularized rectum, potentially even with some type of mild venous abnormality or something like a mild vascular. There's different things that could be down there, but the radiation distorts the vasculature. And so you might always have a little bit of bleeding there. I don't know for sure if you're going to be able to completely resolve that.
Okay. Wanted to thank Dr. Rogers for his time. Okay. What are your thoughts on a whole food plant-based fast mimicking diet? Walter Longo, not the kit, but the idea.
Well, fasting can be helpful in the short term. We talked about this before. The famous place for fasting is True North. And, Jeff had a great result. His LPA dramatically reduced over there. So fasting can help. They've reported some case reports where it helped. But sooner or later, you got to go back to eating your food. So a fast mimicking diet. When you say a fast mimicking diet, I'm not sure exactly of Walter Longo's, but I know he's the guy who's been, correct me if I'm wrong, promoting high protein for older people, which I think is bogus.
That's him. Yeah. And I think so too. And so does Jeff Novick. We've talked about that a lot. The fasting mimicking diet is a diet where you're eating maybe 250 to 500 calories a day. So it's not like a water fast. You are eating, in fact, more fat. So it's makes the fast easier because you do get to have a small meal. Some days you eat. I've done it. I think it's a 4 or 5 day diet. You buy a kit. It's pretty expensive. But it's a fast, but you're eating more calories. It's not a 0 calorie fast.
Yeah, one thing I could say is I eat an OMAD diet, 1 meal a day diet. Some people call that intermittent fasting. I just do it because it's convenient for work. And I do it. I found that I like doing it on my days off also because I just get it over with at night. The smartest you are is when you first wake up in the morning because the lymphatic system has cleaned your brain at night. So I always want to do my academic work on my days off in the morning. On a work day, I already have to get up early enough as it is to go through an entire work. I still work full-time in clinical conventional medicine. So I don't like to have to eat breakfast because then I would have to wake up early. I wouldn't get to sleep as much. The point of it is that I read about how long can glycogen maintain your blood glucose level. And it's really good for the first 24 hours. And once you get past that, more and more, you start switching over to gluconeogenesis. After about 48 hours, you tend to go into ketosis. But most of the time, there's nothing floating around in my blood. So my blood is healthy as it's going to get and as straightforward as it's going to get for avoiding things like insulin resistance and all that. So anyways, for what that's worth, I've been doing that for many years and I've been happy with it. It's not perfect. In a perfect world, like let's say I won the lottery, I didn't have to work. I'd probably eat a late lunch would be the most healthy thing I could do, but I don't want to give up, having my morning free for intellectual work.
Yeah. My thoughts on the fast mimicking diet is, you are fasting, you're reducing, it has benefits. There's a fasting clinic in France or Germany where they have broth. You fast with broth. You have a little bit of, you still get benefits. One where she says also, what are your thoughts on avoiding chickpeas, garlic sprouts, and sweet potatoes because of plant estrogens? Already cut soy, flax. Thanks for your lecture.
Okay, this sounds like some people really want to reduce their estrogens because they got breast cancer, for example. And soy is the big one for estrogen. Chickpeas is a relatively minor one. I wouldn't worry about garlic. Same thing with all this. Sweet potatoes really minimal. I'm not even aware for sure sweet potatoes being significantly estrogenic. I wouldn't eat the chickpeas though. That's the same thing as garbanzo beans. They're 13% fat and they're real high in protein. All beans are high in protein, at least 25%, quite often 35% protein. So I wouldn't eat beans at all for that reason. Yeah, I would quit soy and flax. They're both super estrogenic. So I would leave it at that.
Okay, question on AFib. I heard you briefly cite recoveries from AFib following the rice diet. Almost nothing is published or taught about healing AFib except use of dangerous, even black box drugs. Please take time to discuss what natural protocols, dietary lifestyle suggestions, lifestyle practice, et cetera, for reversing or healing AFib. Do you personally think cardioversion procedure is safe, of any value, or that the repeated shocks can harm the heart long term? Do you think a massive exposure, all types of energy, electrical waves raised, contribute to AFib?
Okay, well, a couple things. One of the things you don't want to do, I see a lot of people, they put their cell phone in the front pocket right over their heart. I think that's a stupid thing to do because it gives off, some EMF. It's a low power microwave transmitter, so that's not good for your heart. I've known cardiologists who did that, and I tease them. I go, "What are you doing? You're microwaving your heart, genius." That was kind of funny. And it was actually a real famous cardiologist. He was a friend of mine. I go, "Gee, you're a real scholar, aren't you?" So anyways, you don't want to be doing that. The next thing is there's a good paper. The author's name is Bianca Brundel, Brundel, and she wrote a paper about atrial fibrillation and its relationship to mitochondrial dysfunction. I think that's a very under-recognized major contributor to disease. And again, I've given lectures on that before. And so, your heart, it's kind of the most active, metabolically active thing in your body is your brain. If you look at a PET scan, FTG glucose, and then next after that is the heart. The heart burns more glucose when it's in congestive heart failure. When it's under normal conditions, it's probably burning about 80% lipids, okay? But you need really good mitochondrial function to have good cardiac function. And I just earlier today spoke about how, there's 70 mitochondrial inhibitors that I'm aware of, and about 40 of them are quite common. So most people are exposing their hearts to mitochondrial inhibitors without realizing it. And you're almost always going to find those in processed food because they use fungal inhibitors. Typical fungal inhibitor, which means a mold inhibitor, so you don't grow mold on it, it doesn't get returned to the corporation, is going to be a succinate dehydrogenase enzyme inhibitor. That's complex 2. It's like where Krebs cycle, tricarboxylic acid cycle, connects to the intermitochondrial membrane. Okay, so you don't want to inhibit that. And what I'm saying is, if I had AFib, what would I do? I try to optimize blood flow, all that low-fat, low-sodium vegan stuff. We talked about that. I would try to avoid all the mitochondrial inhibitors because those could be decreasing cardiac muscle contractility and could lead to progression of AFib. They say that AFib begets AFib. So the longer you have it, the more likely it is you're going to have it permanently. So you want to reverse it as fast as you can. Avoid anything else that could precipitate it. Avoid caffeine. Avoid alcohol. Get your sleep. Avoid unnecessary stress. Go through the entire list of things that cause leaky gut and avoid all of them, because all those things that cause leaky gut, they're also prothrombotic because they're going to increase bacterial endotoxin. We talked about that. LPS, LTA, get into the blood, amyloid transformation of fibrinogen, from alpha helix to beta pleated sheet. They stack up. They form hydrogen bonds in between the individual molecules. The bigger the molecular weight of a molecule in aqueous solution, the more likely it is to precipitate and form a clot. Those small clots can plug up capillaries in the cardiac muscle and can worsen cardiac function, because AFib means that you have abnormal conduction from the cardiac atrium down into the ventricle. So if you have focal areas of ischemia, lack of blood supply to the cardiac muscle, that can lead to a problem with the cardiac electrical conduction pathway, because you have to conduct the signal down from the SA node at the top of the atria down into the atrioventricular bundle in between the ventricles, okay? And you're not going to have normal conductance of that electrical signal if you have areas of destroyed cardiac tissue in the atria from ischemia. So you want to avoid all the things that do that. And then you want to avoid SERCA inhibitors too. Sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase inhibitors, which usually is things that smell bad. If anything smells bad, like if you have to paint the wall, open up the windows, open up the door. If you have to work with chemicals, try to avoid it to the extent you can, but ventilate the area well. because all of these things contribute to decreased ability to handle calcium in a cell, decreased mitochondrial function, which means going to be decreased cardiac contractility, which means increased risk of worsening AFib. So I would try to optimize all that stuff.
She mentions cardioversion procedure. Is that an ablation? What is she referring
Well,
to?
you can do cardioversion with the defibrillator pads and maybe shock the patient back into a normal rhythm. But if that doesn't work, then the next thing is they do an ablation where they'll put a catheter up through the common femoral artery, common femoral vein in the groin, come up into the heart. They'll maybe go through the jugular too. And they're going to do a whole bunch of things where they sometimes burn little holes in the heart to try to disrupt the abnormal conduction pathways. And what I'm trying to say is that would be a last resort for me. You can also get pacemakers and stuff. I would want to try to, maybe it's too late. Maybe you're going to need attempts at cardioversion. You're going to need to go through ablation. But if you can maybe fix it with diet and avoiding these mitochondrial toxins, I'd give that a quick try. Why not? It's always better to solve the problem by yourself first if you're able to do so before going for surgery.
I got 4 friends who in the last 8 months have been diagnosed with AFib. I'm not going to talk about that. Here we go. What's the difference between stable angina and Prinzmetal angina? Can both be addressed by low-fat, starch-based diet?
Yeah, I would also say, just through my internal medicine doctor friends, they tell me AFib is way more common than people think. They see it in tons of their patients, okay? And I can also tell you, my internal medicine friends, they tell me, I've had internal medicine doctors tell me, several of them, every single one of my patients over 60 is mentally slow. They're abnormal, mentally slow, okay? And so what I'm trying to say is these diseases, the gateway diseases are hypertension and diabetes, and they cause all these vascular problems, start creating atherosclerosis all over the place, plugging up arteries. This amyloid clotting is plugging up arteries all over the place. You lose enough brain cells, you're mentally slow. And usually when you're mentally slow, you're mentally tired. You don't got the energy to figure out your problem and to change your behavior and change your life. You're screwed. You just deteriorate. These are people who could still find their way home, but they've lost the capacity for any type of intellectual nuance, any type of energetic change in behavior. So, okay, getting back to the next question is, what about angina?
Stable angina. Yeah.
Conventional stable angina is atherosclerotic. And when you exert yourself, physical exertion, running around, or you're psychologically stressed out, which releases, similar hormones, catecholamines and cortisol, you'll get episodes of cardiac chest pain, cardiac ischemia. Okay. Prinzmetal's is vasospastic angina, and where you get vasospasm of the artery. Sometimes it happens from, again, being stressed out or being cold. And so you can give a person some type of vasodilator like nitrates, for example, or calcium channel blockers. But, it's also has some relationship to cigarette smoking. It could be substance abuse, cocaine or something too. So the bottom line is you want to make yourself healthier. One of the points we've kind of seen it coming across through all these questions today is there's a lot of overlap between all these diseases. And for all of them, optimize your diet. Avoid mitochondrial inhibitors. Avoid SERCA inhibitors. Prevent leaky gut. Get your sleep. Manage your stress. Get your exercise. Get your sunshine. So, this has been called God's way of healing, and it tends to improve everything. Sometimes people have had a disease too long. They've got irreversible damage, irreversible structural damage, and you're not going to completely fix it. But you're still going to get things to be as good as they can be. And if that's not enough, then you superimpose medications on top of it. But it's best to try to avoid, polypharmacy. What most people do is they don't do anything on their own. They just go to the doctor and take a pill. And it's very common. I see patients on 15 or more pills all the time. And you really want to, sometimes you need to take a pill. Maybe you got hypothyroid, you need to take your thyroxine, okay? But you want to minimize that to the extent you can by healthy eating, healthy living.
Great. Okay. Hi, Dr. Rogers. I've been taking thyroid since I was 11. I'm 70 and take levothyroxine, 88 mcg. Kaiser has told me there's a shortage on this medication. I have to take 75 mcg, 2 pills every Sunday. I'm worried, is this good medicine? Are there shortages to manipulate or control us? Without the correct medication, I'm screwed. Any advice, please?
Yeah, that is a little strange that it's a very common medicine like that. All of a sudden, they can't give her standard prescription. That is strange. I'd agree with her on that. But I would say there's other types of thyroid medicine. There's different versions of T4 and T3. And I would recommend that she see a endocrinologist. They're the ones that prescribe thyroid medicines all the time, and see if they can work out some other routine with the different types of thyroid medicines, tyrosine, cytomel, that sort of thing, and see if they can come up with a routine that works for her.
Why would there be a shortage of this medicine at this time? Any idea?
Well, I don't know what's really going on. A lot of times, if you can get rid of an old, cheap, off-patent medicine, then you can prescribe something on patent and make more money off them. I don't know what's going on with this, but like I said, there's pharmaceutical factories all over the place. So I'm always a little skeptical when somebody says, a common traditional medicine, all of a sudden, oh, we just have a shortage of it. I don't know. I'd be a little skeptical of that.
How to reverse the brain after brain traumas.
Okay, so basically what you're kind of talking about is how do you rehab traumatic brain injury, TBI? Number one, don't go back to whatever activity caused it, okay? Like if you're an athlete in a competitive sport, it could be football, boxing, MMA, lacrosse, whatever it is, soccer, I would avoid that sport for a long time. I would take much more time off than is usually taken, because if you go back too soon, you can get a second concussion syndrome, which is much more severe. When you injure brain tissue, the injured brain cells, the dead brain cells, they'll release their neurotransmitter, glutamate, excitatory neurotransmitter. That's like 90% of brain neurotransmitters in the cerebral cortex are excitatory, glutamate in particular. It opens up calcium channels in your brain cells, allowing more calcium to come in and activate those cells, like the NMDA receptor. And what I'm saying is that can cause a sudden excitotoxicity in overactivated adjacent brain cells. And when they're overactivated too far, their metabolic rate too high relative to their oxygen and glucose delivery, they can die. They can go into programmed cell death called apoptosis. So you want to avoid any recurrent trauma in the short interim, because that can be much worse the second time around. And then you want to, like we talked about, post-stroke rehab, optimize blood flow to the area, avoid mitochondrial inhibitors, because this is actually the Peter Rogers, MD, theory of neurodegeneration, is that, first of all, you have a difference between, like what Jack Delatore's theory of the mouse equivalence was to simply drop oxygen and glucose delivery. But I made the point that if you simultaneously raise the metabolic rate due to stimulants, and there's a lot of them, aspartame, caffeine, glyphosate, high-fat diets, because they cause insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, leading to more of the insulin-degrading enzyme being used up for that purpose. It's produced in limited quantities. Then you get more beta-amyloid protein coming back from the periphery of the body, across the blood-brain barrier, into the brain parenchyma, and that's an excitotoxin too, activating NMDA receptor, okay? Smoking cigarettes, all those things, cocaine, the attention deficit medicines like the amphetamine. So anyways, if you increase the metabolic rate while simultaneously decreasing oxygen and glucose delivery, the gap between the two, it's called the supply and demand theory, these brain cells can just die. But it's even worse than that, because quite often what these cells need is good mitochondrial function. They have to make a lot of ATP to be able to pump the calcium out of the cytoplasm. We talked about last week in the lecture here at VegSource that calcium is the aristocratic ion, like a wife. She's the boss of the whole house. Whatever she says goes. And whenever calcium is increased in the cytoplasm, it says release neurotransmitter, release neurotransmitter. It increases the activity of the neuron. So if you have high calcium in the cytoplasm of your neuron, its metabolic rate is going to be higher. And this gap between the metabolic rate up here and the oxygen and glucose delivery gets wider and wider. And if you superimpose upon that decreased mitochondrial function by these mitochondrial inhibitors, you're less able to pump the calcium out of the cell. So you stay hyperactivated, and you increase the risk that the neuron is going to simply say, we cannot meet the metabolic demands of the cell. We must recycle ourselves. They just commit suicide. They go into programmed cell death. When I look at all these demented brains, by far the most common thing I see is a shrunken brain due to exactly this, apoptosis. They call it atrophy of the brain parenchyma. So you don't want to be doing that. Go through the list of mitochondrial inhibitors. I've given lectures on that subject before. I've talked about it quite extensively. I'm the one who figured all that stuff out. So you want to avoid all that stuff. And then anything that smells bad is usually neurotoxic. And a typical example would be like, let's say you're going to the beach. Number one, I only go for short amounts of time, so I don't even wear sunscreen. I don't like sunscreen because all toxic chemicals. But number two, if I had to wear sunscreen, I would just put something on my body. I wouldn't spray it, because then you inhale it. It goes through your olfactory nerve number 2, which goes right by your hippocampus, your olfactory center. And that also can be neurotoxic, like the old deodorants with aluminum in them. If you spray them, you're inhaling some of that, and you're giving aluminum the highway right into your brain. That's neurotoxic. So you want to avoid all this neurotoxic stuff. Exercise produces new neurons. That's called neurogenesis. And so it's good to get some exercise, whatever you're able to do and that's pleasant to do. If I was a really rich guy, like I won the lottery, I would like to have a nice like park where I own some woods near a river or something. And like if I had these traumatic brain injury patients, I would have them like live in an apartment on the facility and go bird watching. because a lot of good things happen when you go bird watching. Number one, you get the exercise, neurogenesis. Number two, you get the sunshine. Number three, you get pleasant social company. Like we used to go bird watching, me and my biology friends. We thought we were going to be wildlife biologists when we were young. And we had an older guy who was a natural scientist. He used to teach us. He was our friend. And it's a lot of fun to talk about the different behavior of all the birds, the ecology of the environment and stuff. You'd be surprised how much you can learn and how enjoyable it is to go bird watching. A lot of biologists, that's how they got interested. Like James Watson, who discovered DNA, it started out with bird watching. Okay, that got me really interested in biology, not just to take a test, but to really understand it. So anyways, that's a great way to rehab them. They'll get some exercise, pleasant social, avoid all the bad stuff, maintain good blood supply of the neuron. So anyways, that's optimal brain TBI rehab. And it takes longer, not just 3 months. You got to do it for years. Try to improve a little bit each day and avoid things that are going to interfere with healing.
I think we should make a short video that's just on mitochondrial inhibitors. Just go through that list, nothing else, because you've given that list in several of your talks, but they're longer talks. I think we need to do one just on that subject for people, or you need to do that. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. Do you think that ivermectin is helpful for a person who has cancer?
I don't know. That's an anti-parasite drug. It was discovered by the Japanese back in the 1970s, and it's been used for a lot of things. We don't need to get into all that right now. But I haven't really studied it that much, but I am aware of it, and it's been good for some other things. So whether or not it's good for cancer, I don't know.
So I'm like Linda, plateaued at 10 pounds from goal weight, have lost 60 pounds. However, also I've had a cough for several years. Doctors can't figure out. It's worse about 1 to 2 hours after meals. I tried to cut down on spices and acid foods and it helps, but cough's still there. They gave me allergy meds, didn't work. They gave me Prilosec, but it didn't have any effect. Coughing, very difficult if you're socializing. Any thoughts?
Well, she might have a hiatal hernia, where the stomach pops up into the chest from abdominal pressure syndrome from previously being constipated, the whole Dennis Burkitt thing. And then you get gastroesophageal reflux where the acid contents of the stomach kind of pop up into the chest a bit. They often have a loosening of the lower esophageal sphincter, so it gets up into the esophagus a little bit. It'll often cause heartburn-like symptoms. That's rather characteristic. It'll happen after eating while the food's in the stomach. That's common. That's probably what it is. You can go through a whole list of foods that tend to make it worse, spicy things, hot things, all that sort of stuff. See if that helps. You can avoid medications. There's some medications that'll loosen the lower esophageal sphincter, and you can avoid those things. See if that makes a difference. There's rare things that could cause it, like an esophageal duplication, paraesophageal hernia, but all that stuff's really rare. It's probably a hiatal hernia with just plain old gastroesophageal reflux. After you eat, it's usually good to stay upright at least 3 hours. Then when you first lay down, lay with your right side down because your stomach empties out to your right. So you don't want it going back up into your esophagus. That could help. And there's other foods that just tend to predispose to it. Things like alcohol, mints, onions. For what it's worth, try avoiding all those things. See if that helps. Eat your high fiber plant diet and you won't be constipated in the future, which could worsen it because you'll have more abdominal pressure on a chronic basis. So that's what I would say. Dr. McDougall wrote a good essay about that. You might want to check out his newsletter. It was something called
Excuse me.
God bless. His essay was "My stomach's on fire and I can't put it out," and that was about GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease.
What kind of water filter do you recommend?
I like a whole house carbon filter and a kitchen reverse osmosis filter. You might, for the whole house, also need an iron filter. Some places have a lot of iron in the water. You might need a softener. But, for what's going to go into your mouth, I like it to be reverse osmosis. Ideally, at a minimum, have a carbon filter for what you're going to drink. You get rid of all those estrogenic chemicals. Our reverse osmosis is better, though, for removing fluoride and aluminum, stuff like that. You could use distillation, but it's kind of awkward. It's much more time consuming. Reverse osmosis underneath the sink is great. There are on top of the countertop units, but they're smaller. They require a little more maintenance, but they're doable. They're doable, but they're not as durable. But those are other options. But you definitely want to filter your water. I think that's another great secret of disease that people aren't aware of. Because I've had these black ladies tell me every person in their family, all the females, every single one of them had a bunch of fibroids and had to get a hysterectomy below 35 years of age, which increases the risk of a lot of cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, and whatnot, congestive heart failure. And, when I talked to them, they were drinking tap water and they were eating meat. So they're getting a lot of estrogenics. And there's a lot of estrogenics, like we also spoke about in these processed, and all these personal care products. And so, anyways.
Okay. Some people eating keto or carnivore claim all the previous ailments have gone away, and it seems true. Why is that? You talked about that a little. Surely all fat protein they eat would have repercussions, maybe accumulating. Number two, if eating fruit causes gas, bloating, why is it? Number three, what causes having yellow complexion around the mouth?
Yeah, we kind of went through this paleo keto nonsense. I don't want to.
Okay. Anything else about fruit gas and bloating? Or
I'll let that one go.
All right. What do you think of the claims a low-fat vegan diet can reverse heart disease? Are they wrong or right, referring to the critics against Dean Ornish research?
I would say it's been around for a long time, including before the days when big money became involved. You know, if you look at Kempner's book, he showed one after another EKG reverting to normal. That's an indicator of worsening coronary artery disease. Nathan Pritikin himself, his EKGs changed back to normal. Okay, that was well known. Dr. McDougall saw it in his patient. Nathan Pritikin saw it in the patients treated at his clinic as well. They found the same thing in the animal studies. The main thing was reducing dietary fat. And they know fat's bad for atherosclerosis. Nathan Pritikin reviewed all the research. David Blankenhorn showed in his studies that it didn't matter what type of fat. They all increased atherosclerosis risk, okay? William Roberts, the big cardiac pathologist that we talked about earlier out of Texas, Baylor, he was the editor of the cardiac journals. He said, the more fat you eat, you know, if you take a herbivore animal, any group of herbivore animals, you feed them a high-fat diet, they get more atherosclerosis. In animal studies, too, there's the green monkey studies. Dr. Esselstyn talks about these, and rodent studies. The more fat you feed them, the more atherosclerosis they get. So you want to minimize dietary fat. That's pretty well known. Esselstyn then sort of has the more recent study where he's got the best results of anybody in the world, like 198 patients. And he says that anybody who followed his low-fat, plant-based diet, vegan diet with no oil, he said not a single one of them ever had a cardiovascular event. That's as good as it gets. There's nothing even close to that. The closest study to Esselstyn was some type of optimized version of the Mediterranean diet called the Lyon study. And Esselstyn was about 30 times better results than what they had. So there's really no question. Then you look at the epidemiology. These low-fat, primarily plant-based communities, they don't get atherosclerosis. They don't get hypertension. They don't get diabetes. Look at the Tarahumara. Look at the Yanomamo. They don't get it. You know, so it's a good deal. Kind of lost you there, Jeff. There we go. Now the text came back on. We're ready for the next question, please.
Oh, now I'm back in. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Dear Peter, I'm puzzled by the possible cause of two conditions found in many women, hyperproclantemia, whatever this is, which my wife has, and also endometriosis, which more and more women get. What do you know?
Okay, well, endometriosis, that can be due to eating more of these estrogenic chemicals. So I would want to avoid all those estrogenic chemicals. And then as far as prolactin, you know, they say the most common thing, actually, let me say one more thing about endometriosis. Dr. Neil Bernard wrote a good book. It was called Your Body in Balance. And he talked about how people eating large amounts of estrogen in their diets will have increased risk of endometriosis. And how some of his patients, as they minimize their intake of animal foods, their endometriosis went away. He had some patients with that type of results. There was also a really good book by a guy named Anthony J. Now, he's not a vegan, and I don't think he knows too much about nutrition, but he wrote a magnificent book about estrogenic chemicals. It's called Estrogeneration, kind of like the estrogen generation. And he goes through all the, he's a lipid biochemist, you know, trained out of Boston. He goes through all the different common patterns of estrogen exposures in personal care products, for example, some of the ones in food and whatnot. It's a very entertaining, very clever book. And high estrogen levels can contribute to having high prolactin levels. It's related to the female reproductive system. What else is relevant? Some people with chronic kidney disease, hypothyroid disease, they'll get elevated prolactin a little bit. You got to be careful about getting brain MRIs, because when you get a brain MRI, a pituitary brain MRI, a lot of times there's artifacts. You get volume averaging on the slice margins where you'll think you're seeing something because you're combining bone with pituitary tissue. And these patients can be trapped in the follow-up for 5 or 10 years. So if you can monitor something by blood levels and the patient is doing well, I would not image so much, and I wouldn't give IV contrast that much, like the gadolinium intravenous contrast, because they can start accumulating gadolinium IV contrast in their brains. You don't want that. And unless you're dealing with a big macroadenoma that's pushing on things and needs to go to the operating room, I think imaging of that stuff is overrated. People with chronic liver disease, polycystic ovary syndrome, they all can get increased prolactin levels. People taking oral contraceptives, opioids, antipsychotics, a lot of these psych meds, tricyclic antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they can all get elevated prolactin levels, synthetic estrogen. So what I'm trying to say is I would try to rule out all of these medication causes, dietary or other disease causes as the source. And if I still couldn't resolve the problem, then I'd go ahead and do a pituitary MRI if it was felt necessary. The prolactin was continuing to go up or there was some other reason to be worried about it. But I would just be careful about jumping to that pituitary MRI. And like I said, too, you might be reversing both problems simultaneously if the patient both has high prolactin and endometriosis. Maybe it's all a question of just increased estrogenic exposure, and you might be able to resolve it that way.
Okay. Is laser hair removal safe? And what about LASIK eye surgery?
I don't have personal experience with laser hair removal, so I don't really know the answer to that. I haven't heard of problems with it, but I don't really have experience with it. I have heard a lot of bad things about LASIKs. I had a friend who was an anesthesiologist. He had that, and he had to take 6 months off from work because he had a lot of vision problems after the surgery. He then later on was able to return to work, but he had a difficult time. He was not back to baseline a year later. I also have some ophthalmology friends, really top-notch ophthalmologists, and they think LASIK is dangerous. Under some circumstances, they'll do it, but they all wear glasses, all of them. They're all, around my age or older, and none of them want it for themselves.
Interesting. Okay. Hi, Dr. Rogers. Name is Connor Cullen. My sister has developed ankylosing spondylosis. I believe it's a hereditary disease. Do you know if there's a diet that could help relieve the symptoms or possibly eliminate symptoms?
Yeah, it's thought to be related to autoimmune diseases, characteristic things associated with something called HLA-B27. And what I'm going to say is I actually think a lot of ANK-SPON, number one, you can get autoimmune disease for all the reasons we talked about. Leaky gut, so I would avoid everything that causes leaky gut. Volatile organic chemicals, periodontal disease of your mouth, your gum disease, okay? That can cause bacterial endotoxins, et cetera, getting all of that stuff. So I would avoid all those things. But ankylosing spondylitis looks a lot like DISH, diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. And DISH is increased in risk if you have ischemia of the spine, lack of blood flow. So atherosclerosis will contribute to that. And then where it starts getting even more interesting is, well, what causes atherosclerosis? All the risk factors, hypertension, diabetes, high-fat diets, et cetera, high-sodium diets. But I'll look at these spines, and I actually wrote a couple books about the spine. One of them is ischemia is the most common cause of back pain. And where it starts getting interesting is glyphosate is glycine phosphate. It's a little more to it than that, but it's essentially like glycine phosphate. Glycine is the smallest amino acid, has the shortest side chain, just a hydrogen. And this lady, Stephanie Seneff, wrote an entire book called Toxic Legacy, where she says that she believes one of the major mechanisms of glyphosate toxicity, this is the stuff that's sprayed on non-organic foods like soy, but a bunch of other non-organic foods too, including oats and beans, that it substitutes itself for glycine in these proteins, including collagen. Collagen is the most common protein in the human body. It's like 1/3 of our bodily proteins. It's like the scaffold of the human body. Okay, so she believes what's happening is that the glyphosate substitutes for glycine in the protein. And it's a triple helix, meaning there's 3 fibrils, these 3 long cords, like 3 ropes wound around each other. You know how DNA is a double helix? This is a triple helix. And they spiral around each other. And these are the tensile strength. Like you've seen the Golden Gate Bridge, the suspension bridge. That's what they're like inside the human body, the scaffolding system. Anyways, what am I saying? You want that short side chain of glycine to wrap things tight and make a triple helix spiraling all the way up and down, supporting your spine, like the anterior longitudinal ligament, the posterior longitudinal ligament, right in front and behind the vertebral body. But if you've got glyphosate substituted for glycine, you can't wrap the collagen helix tight. It's weaker. And so now you're going to get segmental instability. When you get segmental instability, the spine has a lot of proprioceptors. They sense abnormal motion. and their job is to protect the spinal cord and the nerve roots. So the only trick the spine has, like Ralph Waldo Emerson used to say, the hedgehog has only one trick and it's the best trick to play dead. Okay, well, the spine has only one trick. It's to lay down collagen, bone formation, osteophytes, we call them bone spurs, and they'll grow from the vertebra above to the one below, and they'll form and they'll fuse. Okay, and so when they fuse anterior to the side, that's called DISH. Diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis is also called Forestier's disease. And what it's doing is it's fusing those vertebrae so they no longer have abnormal motion, so the process will not progress and damage the spinal cord and nerve roots. All right, so it appears that glyphosate is also doing that. It also turns out fluoride in the drinking water can substitute for hydrogens and disrupt the hydrogen bonding within the collagen. And so when it does that, it weakens the ligament. And you can look this up in 5 seconds. Just type into your browser, skeletal fluorosis. And you'll see that it looks, pretty much exactly the same as DISH, diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, which looks very much the same as ankylosing spondylitis. And what I'm trying to say, and what I wrote about, I'm the one who came up with the Peter Rogers spinal degeneration theory, is that all of this stuff is very much the same. And you're just seeing the spine trying to compensate for segmental instability. A segment is 2 VBs and the disc in between. When there's abnormal motion, the spine senses it and tries to protect itself by fusing the segment. Just like a surgeon puts in pedicle screws from the back to do a pedicle screw fusion. The spine will also form ossification bone spurs along the posterior surface of the vertebral body at the level of the disc base. And that's called, we usually just call it ossification or calcification of the disc, but it progresses to full-blown ossification, bone formation, not just calcium, but bone formation. And the sort of formal name for that is OPLL, ossification of the posterior longitudinal ligament. So now you're just fusing behind. But guess what? You can fuse further back in the spinal canal where the ligamentum flavum is. Okay, that outlines the lamina in the posterior part of the spine. It looks like a tennis racket if you look at it in transverse cross-section. And we call that OLF, ossification of the ligamentum flavum. All right. You can also form ossification across the spinous process ligament. Okay, and that has a fancy name. It's called Bostrup's disease. And what I'm saying is it's all the same thing. The spine trying to protect itself from segmental instability. It's interesting as well. They did some studies on the spines of, there was a decision made to do a lot of construction in Europe, and they had to dig up a bunch of graveyards. Some of the graveyards are where the poor peasants were buried. Some of the graveyards are where the aristocrats were buried, the wealthy. And what they found is the aristocrats had much, much more of this DISH, diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, with a spine fuse all the way from the sacrum up to the skull. And where they ate the rich diets, because the rich people could eat a lot more meat and those types of foods. They had way more of this DISH stuff, okay? And then the way it works its way all the way up from the sacrum, the pelvis, up to the skull is that when you fuse one segment of the spine, the vertebra above it and below it now have to bear more weight, and they have to handle more tensile and side-to-side stress because the intervening middle vertebra and disc are all fused. So they undergo what's called accelerated degeneration. You get the same thing when you do a posterior pedicle screw fusion, accelerated segment degeneration at the adjacent segments, okay? And then that deteriorates, and then it happens at the level above, and then the one above, and it goes all the way up from the pelvis of the spine. So what I'm trying to say is you want to try to break the cycle as best you can. And how do you do that? Avoid all the things that cause autoimmune disease that might be predisposing to an intrinsic autoimmune disease like ankylosing spondylitis. Avoid all the glyphosate by eating organic only, okay? Avoid all the fluoride by having a reverse osmosis filter in your kitchen. You can put a shower fluoride filter as well. Adequate vitamin C is also necessary to hydroxylate the prolines in your collagen. You get that from eating your fruits, your plant foods. So all of those things can help maintain a better functioning spine. And by preventing all the leaky gut, you prevent autoimmune disease, you prevent amyloid clotting, and you get better blood flow to the spine. Trying to walk a lot, that increases the nitric oxide in the paraspinal muscles, the psoas muscle and whatnot. That gets better blood flow to the spine, so you maintain your disc. You don't get ischemic disc degeneration. Because normally the back wall of the aorta is very predisposed to atherosclerosis formation, and then you stenose and occlude those lumbar arteries that go into the spine. Then you have a diminished blood supply to the disc. The outer part of the disc is, I'm showing it now, enfos, like coronal. It's what's called the annulus fibrosus. It's like a steel-belted radial tire. And when that cracks, the center of the disc is like nucleus pulposus is what it's called. It's like a jelly donut. So if you crack the annulus fibrosus, the outer rim, the nucleus pulposus leaks through the crack. And that's how you get a disc herniation. The disc dries out. That's called desiccation of a disc, loses its height, and it loses its integrity. And you'll start getting segmental instability, abnormal motion between the VB, vertebral body above and below, and then you initiate this process of bone spur fusions. So anyways, that's how it all works. So how do you nip that in the bud? Like I said.
Beautiful. Okay. Here we go. Next question, Dr. Rogers. I appreciate your insight. 59-year-old woman, hypertension for 20 years, peripheral neuropathy for 10 years, not diagnosed diabetic since I'm on low oil and low fat vegan diet. Half year ago, I've gotten rid of hypertension pill, but my peripheral neuropathy has gotten worse. I constantly feel numbness and tingling throughout my whole body. It's getting worse. I'm not on any medication. Can you let me know how I should use diet for treating my peripheral neuropathy?
Well, you want to get your oil down to 0. You don't want to have a little bit of oil. You want no oil, none. Diabetic neuropathy is sort of like one of the most common peripheral neuropathies we think of, but you can have neuropathy for other reasons. You could be low in vitamin B12, perhaps. It could sometimes be a side effect of chronic kidney disease, sometimes a side effect of hypothyroid. Sometimes it could be due to lead toxicity or mercury toxicity. It can be in association with autoimmune diseases, like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. There's even these rare neurologic neuropathies like inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. So you could talk to a rheumatologist, but talking to a neurologist might help. There's been a lot of reports of people getting better from diabetic neuropathy when they improve their diet because they get better blood flow. And for what it's worth, when I was in my 30s, I went through a fat phase where I got as fat as 220 pounds, which is quite fat for me. And I gradually became a vegetarian after that. Reading Dr. McDougall's stuff about the starch-based diet helped me turn the corner on that. But the reason I mentioned it is I used to have a lot of pain in my feet when I'd wake up in the morning. I had a bilateral lower extremity peripheral neuropathy. That all went away completely once I became a vegetarian. For a long time, I was a lacto vegetarian, but then I became 100% vegan a little over 6 years ago. So anyways, that might get it all to go away. So that's what I would say is do all those things. But in the back of your mind, at least check your B12, consider heavy metal toxicity with lead, and optimize your blood flow. See if that turns things around for you.
Dr. Rogers, is there any harm to remove wisdom teeth for young adults in the long run? What are the cons that oral surgeons don't want you to know?
Well, anytime you do surgery, there's a risk of a problem. You could damage the adjacent tooth. They can be all kinds of funny orientations, those wisdom teeth. So that's the most posterior molar tooth, the third molar tooth. There's in the mandible down below and the maxilla up above. When you yank out that posterior molar, like an undescended molar, you can now create a fistula between your mouth and the maxillary sinus called the antrum. That's an oral antral fistula that could give you problems with chronic sinusitis potentially. Anytime you go in there and you're removing this bony object, the tooth, you're going to potentially damage the nerve and have chronic pain from the nerve. You could get a chronic sensitivity from nerve damage. You can just have a dried out socket that sometimes can be painful, can take a long time to heal. So if it's causing you some type of major problem, maybe you need to take it out. But, I don't jump into surgery for no reason. There has to be a really, really good reason before I would consider going through a surgery. You could also have side effects from the anesthesia. I'm scared of some of these anesthetics. There's an interesting guy by the name of Nick Lane. He's written a couple interesting books. His most recent book is called Transformers. I think that was written in 2022, something like that, around there. The reason I talk about him is he's primarily an origin of life researcher, but he also does research in mitochondria because they're sort of fundamental to life. And he's given a lecture. Gosh, how would you see it? I'm not sure the name of it. I think it's called What is a Feeling? You can see it on YouTube. And he says that what is the seat of consciousness? And he claims it's the mitochondria. And he claims that because if you give a person like isoflurane, general anesthetic, it'll drop the function of like complex, I think it's complex 1 in the mitochondria, the inner mitochondrial membrane, about 30%, and the patient becomes unconscious. So he says that's all it takes is in that ballpark of 30% drop in complex 1 inner mitochondrial membrane electron transport, and the person becomes unconscious. Obviously, consciousness is multifactorial. The mitochondria is needed to produce the energy, and there's other parts that are needed to make it actually happen. It's not just energy production. You could have energy without consciousness. But I think that's kind of interesting. And there's other sedatives like Versed, the benzodiazepines. Versed is commonly used for intravenous sedation. That's called conscious sedation, but it causes memory loss when you're going for minor procedures, relatively minor procedures in comparison, like colonoscopy, like placement of a portacath or a dialysis catheter or something. And what I'm saying is, now I haven't had patients from, I've given Versed sedation, conscious sedation, over 1,000 patients. I never had any of them complain to me that they had memory loss after that. But I have seen patients, it's uncommon, but I have seen patients have memory loss problems after general anesthetics. Now, I don't know how common that is. I don't know which ones for sure are most common. I'm actually interested in looking into that a little more because I'm interested in mitochondria. But Nick Lane's lecture is quite interesting. Again, I think it's called What is a Feeling? And he goes all into this stuff. Lane is just spelled like it sounds, like a Lane, L-A-N-E, Nick Lane. He's an interesting guy. So what I'm saying is I would not want to be put under general anesthesia and risk having a memory problem unless there was a very good reason. So the next question is, can you do it with local? Maybe. You'd have to ask your dentist. I don't know if that procedure is doable with local anesthetic alone.
All right. How to reverse dawn effect of diabetes. Person following whole foods, plant-based diet without oil. Suppose in night blood glucose levels is 150, but in morning blood sugar levels fasting 150.
Okay, so dawn effect means that, normally our ancestors, when they woke up in the morning, they had to go look for food. And, they fasted at least overnight, at least since dinner, if they had dinner the night before. So you get a burst of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, to raise your blood glucose, to give you energy to go find some food. And the paradox is, the confusing part is, you can get something called a Sabotaging effect, whereby, let's say a person gives themselves too much insulin before going to bed. That could have caused their blood glucose to drop, dangerously low. And then the body goes into a stress response, sympathetic autonomic nervous system response, to raise that blood glucose up. And then when they check it in the morning, what I'm trying to say is they don't know if it's high, if it's just because of the dawn effect, the normal cortisol release in the morning, cortisol surge, or if it's high because of constant, compensation for a Sabotaging effect in the middle of the night because they gave themselves too much insulin. And it matters because if they think it's a dawn effect, they might even increase their insulin dose a little bit. But if it's a Sabotaging effect, they better not increase their insulin too much, or they'll drop their glucose even more in the middle of the night while they were asleep, become more severely hypoglycemic, and potentially cause hypoglycemia-induced brain damage, which you don't want. So how could you deal with that? You can get a continuous glucose monitor that checks your glucose, every interval, every 15 minutes through the night or something, and then you can figure it out. Is it a Sabotaging effect or is it a dawn effect? And then you can decide what to do based on that. So that would be the most important thing, is getting that sorted out.
Great. I think we're going to do just a couple more here. We've been on for a while. Can we manage pancreatic cancer with whole food plant-based diet without oils, no chemo or radiation?
Yeah, who's an interesting guy on that subject is Ron Weiss. He's had some videos. In particular, you can find him on the Chef AJ show. His father had pancreatic cancer, and he went on a low-fat vegan diet, I think, at that time, and he lived way longer than expected. So I think you might find what he had to say about that rather interesting. Most cancer patients can potentially do better, by simultaneously optimizing all this stuff too. Their diet, their nutrition, their sleep, their exercise, and all that too. So I don't specifically have a study showing that it makes a difference there, but it might, because pancreas cancer tends to be a difficult one to treat with conventional methods, with chemo or with surgery. Only a few patients are good candidates for the surgery. Typical surgery like pancreatic head cancer is a Whipple surgery. It's a big surgery. So anyways, you can add nutrition to the other therapies, or you could just do the nutrition thing alone. But I can't tell you that there's proven data saying it works. I think Ron Weiss is interesting. I studied a lot of stuff about nutrition. I think Kelly Turner is interesting. She's a lady from Sloan Kettering that studied all these people with metastatic cancer who had surprisingly good survivals. And very common things they found amongst them was they exercised, they took charge of their own care, were interested in all the details, and did things on their own, didn't just go by what they were told by the medical system. They ate a plant-based diet. So they were religious. They figured out a way to lower their stress level. So anyways, you can look into all that stuff. I think that might be helpful to you.
Great. Dr. Rogers, 70-year-old female here, perfect health, whole food, plant-based vegan. I have NES for over 50 years due to childhood issues. Do you think I should continue to try and resolve this condition or just accept it?
I think what she's talking about is non-epilepsy seizures, or non-like electrical seizures. So it's a person who has all the symptoms of seizures. They can have convulsions, loss of consciousness, but when they do an EEG, they can't find the problem on the EEG. So I wonder if it's just coming from somewhere maybe deeper in the brain that they can't find it. Okay, but they're still having the loss of consciousness, which means, you know, you can't drive if that's a common problem for you. I would, again, optimize all your health parameters and go through all the stuff that I'm talking about. You know, I wrote an entire book about all this stuff called Food, Mood, and IQ, because what I have found, I work as a neuroradiologist. This is one of the things I do. I talk to neurologists all the time. They are not trained in this stuff. I'm the one who teaches the neurologists about this stuff. They know seizure medications, okay? They know that, but they do not know calcium physiology. They don't know mitochondrial inhibitors. They don't know the stuff about the blood-brain barrier. They don't know leaky gut and all this stuff. And that's actually important. They should know it, but they don't. It's just not in their literature, because all of those things could potentially lower your risk of having a seizure. Does that make sense? If you avoid these mitochondrial inhibitors, your neurons will be better able to pump out calcium and prevent themselves from becoming overactivated. Because these same things that can cause seizures can also cause anxiety. You want to not hold your cell phone up to the side of your head, because it's a low-power microwave transmitter that sends a little radiation into your brain, which opens up voltage-gated calcium channels, allowing more calcium to come into your neurons, which gets them hyperactivated. Those stimulant things in food, the excitotoxins, things like glyphosate, aspartame, as well as the amphetamine-like medications, like for, let's say, for treating attention deficit. Cigarettes are also a stimulant. Insulin resistance leading to accumulation of beta amyloid in the periphery, which re-enters the brain. That's an excitotoxin, opens up the NMDA receptor. All of those things are going to increase the hyperactivation of your neurons. Well, what is a seizure? Seizure is hyperactivation of a neuron, okay? And even if they can't find it on your EEG, something is hyperactivating your neurons that make you have a convulsive seizure-like pattern disorder. So there's something doing that, and you want to prevent it. So avoiding all the mitochondrial inhibitors could really help. Getting good blood supply to your brain could really help. And SERCA inhibitors do almost the same thing, because if you, SERCA is sarcoplasm endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase. That means pumping calcium from your cytoplasm into the endoplasmic reticulum. It's a calcium reservoir storage site. Well, if you inhibit the ability to pump that calcium in, then that means the calcium stays higher in the cytoplasm and the neuron is hyperactivated, okay? Psychological stress does the same thing, because it increases glutamate transmission across your synapses in your brain. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, so it also has the effect of being like an excitotoxin. So you want to figure out strategies to minimize your stress. Being religious helps lower stress. Having a strong sense of purpose lowers stress. Avoiding negative social media, or, you know, don't watch the news at night. Avoid unnecessary stress, okay? Because all of those things will have a similar effect. Being sleep deprived will have a similar effect. You know, it raises glutamate transmission, just like psychological stress. It increases cortisol and catecholamines. Caffeine will do that. So I would avoid all those things as a way to minimize hyperactivation in your neurons, and thus decrease the likelihood that they're going to go totally hyperactive and initiate a seizure cascade of reactions, like a domino effect, activating the adjacent other neurons.
Great. I think this might be our last one. Well, maybe not. If I don't use table salt, should I supplement iodine?
Well, you know, if you think you're hypothyroid, you can check your thyroid function test, but I'm not a big fan of just jumping into supplementation. That can cause overactivation of your thyroid. I wouldn't do it if it's necessary, unless it was really necessary. For example, it used to be some people lived in a goiter belt. They ate all their food locally grown, and if there was a shortage of iodine in the soil, their food would be iodine deficient. Their thyroid would enlarge. It's called a goiter, to try to be able to take up more iodine from whatever was available in the blood. But nowadays, most people eat a wide variety of food grown from a wide variety of locations, and they get, you know, plenty of iodine. So most common causes of hypothyroid are things like Hashimoto's and, you know, like leaky gut or sequela of treatment of Graves' disease, okay? So bottom line, I don't take any iodine. I don't think most people need to do that. There's a lot of people always trying to sell something on the internet, you know, claiming that iodine deficiency is more common than it really is due to diet. So I think that's probably exaggerated.
Okay, we'll do another here. Should people without hyperthyroidism avoid foods like goitrogens like pearl, millet, brassica, family vegetables, kale, broccoli, cabbage, sweet potatoes, and some fruits like peaches, strawberries, so they don't develop hyperthyroidism? Should people without GERD avoid foods with citric acid like berries, citrus fruit, tomatoes, cherries, pineapple, and avoid allium vegetables so they don't get GERD?
Well, I think it depends on the individual. For most people, they don't need to be so concerned about it. I mean, the big goitrogenic things would be like soy. I would never eat soy. I think soy is like a much, much worse food than is widely recognized, okay? It's like one of the more powerful goitrogenic things, inhibiting thyroid function. Flax also has some goitrogenic properties, so I don't recommend flax either. It's real high in fat. It's real estrogenic. Millet is pretty strong goitrogenic as well, so that could be an argument for avoiding millet. Then you got sort of the moderate level of goitrogenic foods, and that's things like a lot of your cruciferous veggies. I'll still eat those sometimes. I don't eat them on a routine basis, but I eat them sometimes. If I was hypothyroid, I wouldn't eat them. The cruciferous vegetables are all the things like kale, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, that sort of stuff. And then the other stuff is sort of what I call the weak goitrogens, and I think those are overrated. I'm not concerned about those. They're pretty mild stuff.
Terrific. Well, Peter, I think we are going to wrap it up here. Huge thanks to you, Dr. Rogers, for sharing so much insight today. And as always, incredibly helpful, practical, and backed by serious science. So if your question did not get answered, don't worry. We're going to do this again soon. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my Substack so you will hear about it in time to get your question in early. If you got something valuable out of today, please like the video, share it with a friend, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Again, Peter, thank you. And thanks to everybody for being part of this video. We will see you on the next one. Thanks.